everybody. How are we all this morning? I hope you've had a bite to eat, a nice breakfast, a cup of coffee. So you should all know the housekeeping drill by now. Here it goes again. Toilets over to your left, go sort of around, snake down the hallway, over to your left. 3 fire escapes, one over near the toilets, one over near the lift, and one in this direction. Reminder, remember the tricky lift, not more than 5 or so people, otherwise you might get stuck in the lift and that would be a lot of fun. And also we have some trick doors as well, I've been told this morning. These doors over here on the left, which you might sort of head out towards, to go towards the toilets, you won't be able to come back in through them apparently, so you might find your way back around. I'm sure you won't get trapped and you'll find your way eventually somehow. Just giving you a forewarning.
Someone got locked in the loo last time.
Yes, somebody got locked in the loo last time. But that's not going to happen this time round. So, thanks everybody for being here again. Before I hand over to Professor Patricia O'Brien to officially welcome you, I thought I might sort of just say 1 or 2 things, because I myself have been reflecting on Lorna talking about innovation and new ventures at our last breakfast. So I thought I would share with you some of the new ventures and innovations that CDS is trying to be engaged in. We are your last chance to enroll now in the Diploma of Community Service Work, Person-Centeredness and Diploma of Disability that CDS is running. Really encourage you to enroll. These diplomas are taught by CDS staff, all with tertiary qualifications and both research and practice backgrounds. So hopefully very good quality of these diplomas. Really encourage you to enroll into those, people you might know who would be interested. Also very exciting innovation, our award-winning ICANN assessment. We are launching version 5 of our ICANN assessment prior to the end of this financial year. More details will be coming out soon, but we really hope a big improvement in the flexibility and user-friendliness and administration time of our ICANN support needs assessment tool. So that's very exciting for CDS as well. And another innovative venture that we're engaging in this year, our Direct Support Professional Conference coming in July, announcing the 4th keynote. You guys are the first people to hear it, our 4th keynote. So as you can see there, we have John and Connie Lyle O'Brien. Many of you would know John O'Brien, Associate Professor Vivian Ritchie's Phil Tuckerman, and our 4th keynote, we're now announcing Dr. Peter Gibilisko, author of Politics, Disability, Social Inclusion. So that should be fantastic. That's all from me, so I'm going to put us back here, and I'm now going to hand over to Professor Patricia O'Brien. Now you would know by now, I've told you that Tricia has done some great work around inclusive research and education, that she's an author of different books that she's authored. I told you about the co-residency model that she lived in. I also told you that she's married to a Kiwi. Did you know Patricia was teaching and doing some of the person-centered things over in Ireland before all the buzz in Australia, before we were even talking about person-centeredness? Tricia was doing some of this, the pathing and mapping and training and person-centered thinking back when she was in Ireland. So I hand to you now, Professor Patricia O'Brien.
Thanks very much. Good morning, and thanks, Sam. And there's only one more introduction to go at our last breakfast, but thank you for your consideration. Yes, we were working in person-centeredness in Ireland, well, I suppose now, what was it? It's 8 years since I've worked there, but it was good to have that opportunity. And it was at that stage, too, that we became very aware of the work of Helen Sanderson, and so it's my pleasure today to introduce you presently to Stephen Stirk, who is a colleague of Helen's. But before I continue, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, both past and present. And to tell you that today's conversation is on commitment, and if you go into the booklet, you will see what Peter Block says about commitment. And I thought I'd open up by commenting on the purpose of today's conversation. So it's on page 2. As you know, last time the conversation was on innovation, but today's conversation takes us further, and what the message Block is giving to us is that if we are committed, we should have no expectations of return, and the commitment is more than barter or lip service, and the commitments that we make that are important are those that we make to peers and citizens. And Block suggests that there are two types of commitment, and keep this in mind now as we move into the change that is going to take place as a result of the NDIS. Block talks about the commitment, which is our own behaviour, commitment to the way in which we're going to relate with one another, and then also the commitment to results and outcomes. So our commitment to visioning what could be new ways of thinking, new outcomes arising from the introduction of the NDIS. So before I just go around the table and introduce Stephen, and then you might like to introduce yourself to Stephen, I would just like to tell you how today is going to run. It's slightly different in that Stephen will present. Stephen's paper is in the booklet, and as you listen to Stephen's first presentation, the invitation is to think about, well, what do these messages mean to me in terms of my own commitment? What do these messages mean to me in terms of the risk that I'm prepared to take? So after Stephen presents, there will be time for some of our World Cafe conversation, but it won't be as long as normal, because with Stephen being here, I've actually asked him if he would give a second presentation, and that will be after morning tea. And in that presentation, he will reflect on some of the issues that he experienced as Human Resource Manager in working for United Response, which is a very large organisation, but a very thoughtful, mindful organisation in the UK. And I thought that that's gold for us to hear how this organisation transitioned into a person-centred organisation. So Stephen, rather than reflecting on our conversation, will present that. So Stephen, as I've said, you are, and up until recently were, the Director of Human Resources at United Response. Prior to that, you've had a very long and significant career in the area of business, particularly involved with organisational design and organisational development, and working in a person-centred manner even before moving to United Response in the area of human resources. But another characteristic, a very important one, which I'm sure has influenced Stephen's journey, is that he is the parent of a young woman who's 27 who has a disability. Stephen comes from the northern parts of England, and I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit about himself. But Stephen, thank you for being with us today, and I would just invite people just to briefly introduce themselves and tell you where they're from, and we are then going to end our round. Shirley has a reflection on innovation based on last week's presentation. So Shirley, we'll come to you last for the introduction, and if we could hear your reflection, because I think that actually sums up what we all were invited to think about last time from Lorna Sullivan. But David, can I ask you to introduce yourself to Stephen first off?
Hi, I'm David Rafferty from Achieve Australia, which is a NGO based in the northern part of Sydney. We're supporting about 500 people through a range of programs, pretty typical, and I have a corporate development role currently. And this is the 5th of 6 conversations, and if this is anything like last time, it'll be pretty good.
Thanks, David. So we'll come this way.
Hi, I'm Maria from Woodview Community Services. We're more on the west side of Sydney, and Woodview concentrates on day programs for people with intellectual disabilities.
Thank you. I'm Trish Wetton from FaHCSIA Australia. We operate group homes for young adults who identify with additional disabilities right throughout Sydney.
Good morning, I'm Mariana, also with FaHCSIA Australia, and I'm the Accommodation Services Manager there.
Hello, I'm Connie Oswald. I'm also with FaHCSIA Australia, and I'm one of the house managers in the Mirren area, and this is my first conversation. So.
Fantastic.
Hi Stephen, I'm Megan Sprague. I'm from Achieve Australia with David Rafferty. As he said, we provide a range of different services in the disabilities. I specifically work in
risk management, systems management, and ICT, and quality management. Full gambit of systems.
Everything.
Pauline.
Hi, I'm Pauline Stanley. We've got a chance to talk, and I'm the change management consultant working at NDS, which is the National Body for Disability Providers in Australia.
I'm Sir Hadogers. I'm the CEO of WinGap. We have a range of services.
Okay, thanks.
Karen Stace, also with NDS, but was working with a smallish disability service in Hunter, and I'm based in Newcastle.
Okay, good.
I'm Tony Wilson. I'm a manager with Uniting Care Disability and manage a range of services right across Sydney for children, young people and families.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Gordon Duff from National Disability Services. I head up our national policy and research unit.
Thanks. Welcome, Gore.
Georgina Michaelis, I'm CEO of Gore. We have a real estate organisation. We have a small school and accommodation and day service disability specialists.
Great, good.
In
Thank
the
you.
northwest of Sydney.
Good.
I'm Peter Knight. I work for Wesley Mission. It's got a range of services around New South Wales, centred on Sydney, and group homes and day programs and that sort of thing we have for people with disabilities, and really benefited from coming along and just thinking about those differently and what we'll do in the future.
Great. We'll come up to you, Claire.
I'm Claire. I'm a psychologist and research fellow at the Centre for Disability Studies.
Great, thank you.
I'm Alan. I'm also with National Disability Services.
Very welcome.
I'm Gillian. I'm from Sunshine. We're based in Pymble, and we support people in a range of services.
Great, thanks, Julie.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm from Northcote, and I'm a person-centred presenter and facilitator.
Great, good, thank you.
Hi, I'm Lilia, and I'm from Northcote as well, and I'm here to support Shirley and Ben.
Great. Sue, would you like to introduce yourself before we hear from Shirley? Oh, sorry.
I'm Sue. I work with Northcote as well, and I'm a person-centred champion and presenter, as well as working with families in the Penrith, Blue Mountains, Hawkesbury area who are in crisis where there's a child with a disability.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Shirley.
Hi, my name is Shirley. I am from Northgate.
Your reflection, Shirley, would be great here.
My name is Shirley and I am from Northcott. Living with a disability can be challenging. Sometimes society looks down on us and doesn't see our abilities. When others see our abilities, they will think we are like everyone and have skills and then they'll want to learn more. I wish instead of disability, it should be like seeability, because everyone has an ability and I want others to see a person for what they can do instead what they can do. Personally, the people who know me well and see my ability, they do support me with my choices. If the people can't see my abilities, then they don't know what I am or what I am capable of, and they treat me differently to how they would treat someone without a disability. People who know me are supportive and encourage me to do my best. On this subject, innovation has helped me to communicate and express myself, and this has meant that other people have been able to get to know me. They have been able to hear my views and my opinions and ask me questions. they are able to see me as more than my disability. In this way, I feel independent, and that feels great. Innovation has allowed me greater access to choice. It has given me a bigger voice. These innovations include iPad, computers, email, iPhone, and the applications and programs that I am able to use through them. It has opened up my communication, and that has resulted in greater inclusion for me in life.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Shirley. Thank you for reflecting on the topic of last time. I think it's a great gift to us to be able to listen to your own personal reflection. Thank you. So, Stephen, at this stage, could I hand over to you?
Sure.
And if you wish to follow Stephen's presentation, it's actually in the booklet. It's a paper that he's written. So, thank you.
Can you all hear me all right from here? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a bit early in the morning for me and a bit jet lagged, so if you don't mind, I'm actually going to use my notes to read from this morning. And if that feels a bit formal, I'm sorry about that, but I'm also getting a bit old and I can't remember everything I wrote in here. So we'll see how it goes, shall we? And do feel free, by the way, if something I'm saying doesn't make any sense, to heckle or wave at me or whatever. That would be absolutely fine. So just let me start with a little bit about myself, I suppose. Just so you know me a bit and perhaps understand why I say some of the things that I do. I come from a beautiful area called Teesdale, which is in the northeast of England, if any of you know that. If anybody's heard of the Yorkshire Dales, have you heard of the Yorkshire Dales? Well, I live in the Durham Dales, which are even better. But don't tell anybody that, because we don't want all the tourists coming. Okay. I've lived there most of my life, apart from a couple of periods where I lived elsewhere in the UK, in York and Scotland. And I've done a lot of travel around the world to various parts of the world. Interestingly enough, never here. But most other parts of the world I've travelled with previous employers. Patricia mentioned my daughter. I have a disabled daughter, Lucy, and I'm going to flavour my talk this morning with a little bit about Lucy and some personal examples there. And I'm also blessed with 17-year-old twins. That's those of you that have teenagers will know the word blessed is somewhat exaggerated there in that statement. 17 going on about 35, I think, is where they are at the moment. But I love them dearly. In terms of work experience, until fairly recently, about 6-7 years ago, I worked in what you might call big business, really. One part of that big business was sweeties, confectionery and grocery with... You heard of a company called Roundtree? Yeah, Roundtree's fruit pastels and Smarties and all that stuff. Now owned by the Nestle Corporation. I still can't bring myself to call them Nestle's fruit pastels. I just can't do that. So I spent about 12 years there, getting very fat, eating lots of chocolate, and then I moved on to what eventually became GlaxoSmithKline after a couple of mergers. So that's, I guess, one of the big 4 pharma companies in the world. So I like to tell people that my history is all in sweeties and drugs. So take that for what you will. So before I moved into social care, I was with this big pharmaceutical company, and there came a time when they kind of noticed that I lived in this beautiful part of Teesdale, but actually I was working most of the time in the south. And they made me an offer to move to the south, and I politely declined it because of my daughter, really. I had created an environment for my daughter where she was very well supported by a circle of support that I knew in an area I knew very well, and the thought of moving her to somewhere I didn't know very well was quite challenging. So I actually made a decision, a family decision if you like, to move, to stop working in big business and move into social care. So that's how I initially became head of learning and development at what was then called the Commission for Social Care Inspection, and is now called the Care Quality Commission. And they are the, it's a kind of arm's length government body. Do you know about the Care Quality Commission in the UK? The kind of government arm's length body who are responsible for the regulation and inspection of the social care, now health and social care sector, if you like, in the UK. And when I was with them, it was for the social care sector only, and I was the head of learning development there. And that was my first experience, really, of moving into social care. And I was there while there was some quite significant transition to a different kind of regulation, I suppose, a different kind of inspection, which they called Inspecting for Better Lives. And I suppose that was the beginning of moving towards thinking about person-centred approaches from a regulatory perspective, and that's where my interest began to be inspired, I guess, in doing more with this. And because I was in what was effectively the public sector, I was rather dissatisfied, I suppose, with the way that was being done, and decided that I wanted to be nearer the sharp end of this, and therefore applied for and got the job of HR Director at United Response. And I was there for about 5 or 6 years, and that's where I met Helen Sanderson, and that's where I collaborated with her in writing a book about creating person-centred organisations. So I'll just tell you a little story about joining United Response, which I think, for me, really set the tone of where I was going to go with all of this. The selection process that I went through was pretty conventional originally. You know, there's an advert in the trade press for HR people, and I saw that. Didn't have a clue who United Response were, but I knew they were in social care, so I went along. And I was interviewed pretty conventionally by the people that I was going to be managing, because they wanted to check out who might be their boss. And I saw the managing director and the chief executive, and that kind of got me thinking, because it was very clear to me from talking to those two people where their hearts were, and that's pretty fundamental to me, that my heart's got to be somewhere in what I'm doing, and theirs clearly were. But the best bit was coming back again the next day for another interview, and being interviewed by, well, initially coming into the building and noticing all around me sort of pictures of people who were being supported by United Response, being entertained, having fun, enjoying themselves in life. Received at reception by someone who had a learning disability and shown into the premises. To meet the people who were going to do my final interview for the role, who were actually a panel of 4 people who were supported by United Response and their support workers. It was very clear to me that this was the important bit of the selection process. This was the bit that mattered. And it sent a message to me, really, about what this organisation really did believe and what it really valued. It was pretty terrifying, actually. It was probably the worst interview I've ever had in my life, and the most difficult I've had in my life. But boy, was it clear to me what really mattered in that organisation. And I was absolutely certain that if I didn't do well with those 4 people, I was not going to get that job. And by this time I really wanted it, because of what they were doing, because they were putting me in that position. Now, I had a slight disadvantage, to be fair, over the other applicants, because I do have a disabled daughter, so I'm fairly used to relating to people with disabilities, obviously. But it was still very tough. And if I just tell you 2 of the questions that they asked me, one was, okay then, so we'll give you the job as HR Director, what are you going to do for us? Wow. And that was kind of tough to answer. I waffled something or other that was fairly convincing and got away with it. But the next hard question was, right, tell us a joke. And what does that say to you about what's important around here in an organisation? You know, it said a lot to me about what really matters. You know, my job is to help them. That's what it's about. And if they want me to entertain them and tell them a joke, that's what I better do. So I did. It was a terrible joke, and I won't repeat it. But I got away with it anyway. And fortunately, at the time, my twins were 5, so I had loads of playground jokes. So that was good. Anyway, you can see what that did, can't you? You can see what that did to me. It just inspired me to think, here's an organisation, probably for the first time in my life, where it was absolutely clear, just from talking to them for a few hours, what they were about and where their values were. Absolutely clear. So that's really started to spur my interest in person-centeredness. So that's a bit about how I got to where I am. And what I'm going to do in this part of my talk this morning is, if you'll indulge me, I am going to talk a bit about work stuff and professional stuff, but I'm going to flavour it with some personal examples. So I'm going to talk a bit about my daughter and some of the experiences I've had with providers and with funders with my daughter, to kind of illustrate how I feel about the way things should be done by some stories about how they weren't done very well. So are you okay with that, by the way? So by necessity, that puts a bit of emotion into the speech, but if you're okay with that, we'll do that. So I'm going to put some of that in. I know a little bit about a national disability insurance scheme that seems to be exercising everybody's minds over here at the moment. So I'm going to comment a bit about not quite the same thing, but something similar along the routes of sort of individual budgets and individual service funds in the UK. So I'm going to talk about family involvement, the importance of that, and some of the sort of typical issues I've faced there. I'll also talk a little bit in this talk about transformation to a person-centred culture, but actually when I talk later on with some slides, I'll say more about that from a practical perspective. Is my voice still okay, by the way? Can you still hear me? All right. That's good. Okay. Just a comment first, perhaps, on the language that I use. There are sort of two expressions, personalisation and person-centred approaches. And often they get kind of mixed up. So just so you're clear where I use them. For me, personalisation means the design of services around an individual. So it means how you put together whatever facilities, hours of support. It's the design element of that's what I mean by personalisation. And you're doing that to match essentially what is important to and important for the person who requires that support. You're also doing that to give them as much choice as you possibly can in how that is done, and also to, last but not least really, contribute in some way to their community. So that's what when I'm talking about personalisation, I'm meaning that sort of circle of activity. When I talk about, that by the way could include the use of an individual budget, which may be held by the person themselves who's receiving the support, but it might be by the use of an individual service fund, something slightly different, which is a fund held by a provider on behalf of that individual receiving the support. And if that didn't make sense to you, ask me a question and we'll perhaps come back to that later. When I talk about person-centred tools and practices, this is at a different level. I'm talking there, once you've got that design of service, about the tools, the practices that you then use to deliver the support. Okay? So this is the practicalities of how you take that design around the person and actually do it, actually deliver it. So that's where tools like working, not working, important to, important for, person-centred reviews and so on come into play at that level. So that's the way I use the language. I'd like to start, I guess, with talking about the involvement and engagement of families and the people we support in that activity of designing services. And that, of course, is at a different level of importance to a provider when the person receiving the support is actually paying for it themselves. So if they're a self-funder or they have an individual budget which gives them control over how that support is delivered, it's at a different level of importance than if somebody else is paying for that service on their behalf, clearly. So that's when providers really need to pay attention to what they're doing. However, even if the person receiving the support is not the budget holder, I would suggest to you that the same principles of applying person-centred approaches should apply, because you never know, one day that individual may well be the budget holder, and they may well be the person who's directing you and giving them their support. So there's a number of ways in which people we support and their families can be engaged in working with us. I should have said, by the way, I use the phrase people we support because that's embedded in me. Is that, you okay with that phrase? I don't use service user or anything like that. But by people we support, I mean exactly what it says on the tin. So just talking about engaging people we support and their families in the delivery of services, there's a number of ways that I've seen this done. If you take United Response as an example, even before the service delivery has started, so when they're in the commissioning process, if you like, and talking to people about what they want, there's a process called How I Like and Need My Support that they go through. So it's based on person-centred tools, and it walks a family through, and the individual being supported through exactly what it says, how they like their support, how they need their support. So it looks at both of those things. So right from the very beginning, it's engaging the person who support, their family, any other people in that circle of support that they may have, in defining what that service should look like. And it talks about things, about what staff should look like and what skills they should have and that kind of thing. So it starts there. Once the commissioning has taken place, there's a process called matching staff, which is one of the person-centred tools which you may be familiar with, which can be used then to involve the people we support in the actual choice of the people that they want to support them. And obviously, if you're familiar with this, it looks at a number of different aspects of the potential supporters and how that matches up with the likes and needs that were identified at the first stage there. Another way of engagement is, that I've seen in some companies, some organisations, is family members also being involved in that discussion with the provider about the level of funding and how that's attributed. Sometimes that's been a bit difficult, to be honest, because some funders don't like family members being there. Don't know why, but they seem to not like that very much. But that's another way that I've seen families being encouraged to take part in that kind of discussion about how support and funding is allocated. And that for me just follows a fairly simple principle, which is, you may have heard this phrase, but I quite like it. It's called no decisions about me without me. And it's a little phrase I like to just remind people of quite often when I'm talking particularly about my own daughter. Going on from that point on an ongoing basis, there are other sort of tools and techniques that can be used to engage personally support, families, other people in that process. Things like person-centred reviews. And in the UK now, I don't know whether you've seen this over here yet, but there's something called the Outcome Star. Have you heard of the Outcome Star? Yeah, one or two nods around the room. That's another way now that's being brought in to have a more precise way, I suppose, of looking at the measurement of outcomes for people we support. Interesting new development. Other ways of engaging people, you can have input to the direction of the organisation through, for example, membership of local area management teams, divisional management teams, regional management teams, and so on. So these are opportunities for people we support and families to come and join in the actual management of a sector of the business. And that happens in United Response and has been really successful in really getting into the detail of what's working and not working around here. And being able to respond to that through the local management, area management, divisional management, or even the total organisation management by that input. One of the ways that that's done, again, in United Response is through the use of what's called in the book the Working Together for Change process, but in United Response is called the Learning and Reflection process. And that, again, there are forums in 4 different places in divisions around the country, which are then accumulated into an overall set of input from the people we support and their circles of support, their families and loved ones and so on, which actually goes right to the top of the organisation and is distilled into 5 or 6 different priorities, which are then fed into the business planning process of the organisation. So there's a real bottom-up pull there from the people who matter into the actual operating plans of the organisation. A really, really powerful technique. Other things, quality checkers is something that's been introduced in a number of places in the UK, and again, these are people we support who have been trained in some tools and techniques for measuring quality, and go and visit different services and do an assessment of those services. That's fed back, in the case of United Response, to the quality management function, which happened to report to me when I was there, and that's distilled into reports for the directors team to look at where we've got issues, where there might be patterns of certain types of problems and so on. Again, information right from the root going into the quality management processes of the organisation. And another aspect of this is equality and diversity. Again, United Response has a group of people which is called Diverse Voices, who tour around the country, so they go to 4 or 5 different places in the UK, hold a meeting to which people we support and family members and staff as well are invited. So if you can make it, you can come. So typically that would be a meeting of 30 or 40 people, quite a big meeting, and they discuss issues about equality and diversity. And again, so you're getting input there from staff and family members, from people we support about the different aspects of that. And of course that information is then used as advice to the directors about the direction to take things in. Also, a number of organisations encourage attendance of things like trustee boards, some actually members sitting on the board or as advisors to the board. That happens quite a bit. And other things like taking part in consultancy work and training work is very common. So lots of different ways of engaging people we support and families in these activities. But it's important, as I think you can probably see from what I've said, that voice of the people we support and their loved ones, their families, is collected in a number of different ways and fed into that business planning process. Lots of providers make a pretty good job, I think, of taking person-centred approaches to people we support especially, and in trying to understand families. Where I come from is that same kind of attitude, that same approach should also be taken towards staff, and that's why I'm a passionate exponent, I think, of taking person-centred approaches across the board. That's what the book is all about, really. It's about applying tools and techniques that perhaps came from being used with person-centred planning and person-centred thinking with people who need support, but applying those same principles with other members of staff, other stakeholders, I guess. And that's the whole principle behind the book there. So as a parent, I guess I would expect to be treated in a person-centred way, in the same way as I would expect to be treating others as a business person, if you like. And regrettably, that hasn't always been the case. I've become what I call myself what I call a serial complainer. I like to harangue those in authority about being person-centred. So I do have a bit of a reputation for that. But I'm not going to hide from it. I'm passionate about people who are in positions of authority taking the right approach, taking person-centred approach, both to my daughter but also to me as a family member. So I want to talk about what I've called in my paper some of the hot buttons that get me excited and make me this kind of serial complainer. And the first of those is risk. In the UK, it's been a bit of a national pastime, I suppose, worrying about risk and stopping people doing things because of risk and all the rest of it. I have to say, right now, the Health and Safety Executive in the UK are trying to unblock some of this. So they're putting out lots of public messages about how silly it is not to do some things by being worried about health and safety. And actually a colleague of mine is currently working with them to redefine the approach to health and safety in social care. And surprise, surprise, we're getting some of the risk enablement messages from the book there into that approach. So that could be good news in due course. So obviously I think the proper culture should be one of risk enablement, not of mollycoddling people, not of being overprotective. And I'm just going to give you a quick personal example of that. What I mean by being overprotective. And in this case it's about being overprotective of staff and being worried about risk. My daughter Lucy loves swimming. It's one of the things she loves most and gets enjoyment out of. And she does do a day centre and does that. And we discovered that you know, in her book that comes back with her every day, that she was missing out on swimming. And we couldn't understand why that was. Because it's the thing she loves most. So, and it kept happening. So we eventually thought, well, we'll go and see what's going on. So we did. Took Lucy up there, and it turns out that the physiotherapist, or I think that's the right title for the person concerned. She and I fell out, so I don't quite know.
Physio-terrorists,
yes,
sometimes.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. I'm going to remember. I love that. I'm going to write that down. Anyway, it turns out that the physio had Lucy's epileptic, and she often has a fit in the morning or a seizure before she goes to the swimming. And it turns out that the physiotherapist had a report about this from the staff there, and it was kind of shock horror reaction. Oh my God! If she's had a seizure, you know, she'll be heavy to move around. It's too risky for you. You know, don't try and get her in the pool. You might injure yourself, and you know, all this stuff. And that's why she wasn't going in the pool. What happened was the person, the transport, the taxi who took her there, they'd turn up with Lucy, and the staff would say, has she had a seizure on the way here this morning? And they'd say, oh yes, she did. So they'd say, well, she can't go in the pool then. Not, let's just think about this, and you know, how is she? Has she recovered? Is this possible? Can we enable this risk to be taken? Just can't do it then. Physiotherapist says, might hurt ourselves. Now you can imagine how I felt about that. And it just so happened that when we took Lucy, she did have a seizure on the way there in the morning. So when she got there, I said, Lucy just had a seizure, and I got the answer, we're not taking her in the pool then. So I said, oh yes you are, and if you won't do it, I will. And so we showed them how to do it. We showed them that Lucy can recover most of the time if she's encouraged to do so. We showed them how you can actually assist her in a certain way to move and get in the pool. And surprise, surprise, since we showed them how to do that and had that conversation, shall we say, Lucy gets to go swimming every time that she goes there. So that for me is just an illustration of what's wrong about an approach to risk. It's, you know, it's my favourite question is, who is this about? And that's what I said to these people there. Who's this about? Is it about Lucy, or is it about you, the staff? Are you trying to enable Lucy to have a better life, or are you trying to protect your staff? What's that about? And they didn't like it, by the way, but we've had that conversation a few times. So just a little example of how I feel about risk enablement as opposed to risk aversion. Am I doing okay for time?
Yeah, fine.
Next area I just want to talk about is about not doing harm to people or not abusing people. You probably know, if you heard recently in the UK, there's been quite a furore about abuse of people relating to a particular nasty set of events at a place called Winterbourne View, some of you heard of this? It was a privately run hospital, a commercial provider, if you like, rather than a not-for-profit provider. He ran a small hospital for people with various disabilities in the southwest, and there was horrendous abuse going on there of people being supported. It was just awful. And as a result of that, there's been a lot of reaction, as you can imagine. There's been various government reports, and frankly some kind of knee-jerk reaction to what's been going on there. And every provider in the UK has been forced to look at their policies and procedures for handling potential abuse situations. And of course that too has brought on some of this risk aversion back to the fore again. But I just wanted to give you my view of harm, if you like, not doing harm to people or abusing people, if you like, in a different sense. And so obviously there's a lot of clarity over what is abuse, but as a parent I have a slightly broader definition of that. And of course it's a primary duty of a provider to protect people being supported from harm. But how do you define what's harm is the issue that I have. And I'll give you another personal example of what I mean by a provider potentially doing harm when actually they don't mean to. They're just trying to carry out that duty of protecting someone they support from harm. And again, it's about, my daughter is able to walk. She can walk about without much support. She needs minimum sort of supervision to do that. But we noticed a little while ago that she had some new support workers, some people who weren't very used to her. And it just so happens that she has one leg shorter than the other, and she has a lift on the shoe, so she tends to favour that side. And we realised that she was coming home and she actually couldn't support herself properly on her left-hand side. She'd lost some of that ability to walk properly, which she'd been doing all of her life. We thought it was a bit odd, and when we explored that, we found that actually these new support workers, what they were doing for the right reasons, they were trying to support her well and trying to avoid risk, trying to avoid her harming herself. They're actually supporting her completely on this side of her body. So there was always somebody there who had hold of her and was holding her up on that side of her body. Now, Lucy's like most of us. If somebody does something for you, you'll probably let them do it, won't you? And that's what she was doing. She's like, oh, there's always somebody there helping me. That's fine. I'll just live with that. I don't need bother about trying to use my left leg, so I won't. And she actually lost some of that ability to do it herself. So we had to retrain her effectively into doing that for herself. And for me, that's my broader definition of harm. It's people who are providing that support being conscious that actually you can actually take people backwards. You can stop them doing things that actually they are able to do. And that's not our job as providers. Our job is to encourage people to do more and to learn. So that for me was again a kind of classic example of just over-supporting and actually, without meaning to, doing harm, rather than actually improving the situation. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that again is something I try to send a message to support staff about, is just think about what you're doing. Think about, are you really over-supporting? And that takes me to my next area, which I've called just enough support. And for me, it has to be a key assumption that people we support can learn, can develop, can do new things, regardless of where they are. And I would apply that even, for example, to people with dementia, for example. So there's a school of thought now, there's one school of thought, isn't there, that people with dementia actually can't learn, but there is an emerging school of thought, I think, that they can, and that's the best way to support them, is to carry on with that belief that they can learn and develop things. And I'm in that school of thought. So as providers, the job is to enable that development, enable that learning, rather than inhibit it. And as a parent, I know I can sometimes get in the way of that, actually. There are some occasions when I can be on the other side of the fence and not allowing that to happen. And my story here is about having been away on business once and coming home having not communicated with my wife very much, and she showed me a picture, and it was of Lucy sitting in a canoe with a guy in the back paddling her across a lake, and I was horrified. Who did that without consulting with me about the risk that was involved in that? That was my first thought. And then, of course, my second thought, which was more sensible, was actually this has been pretty well thought through. She's got the right kit on, she's got an absolute expert supporting her. That's just the right amount of support. Somebody's evaluated that risk and they've taken it. And you know what? Lucy loved it. Absolutely loved it. So I felt quite shamed then. I thought, idiot. You know, you're trying to tell people yourself how to do things properly. They do it properly and you're not happy with it. So sometimes, you know, if you're a provider, you need to educate parents as well and keep us on the right track. I've also seen elsewhere, from my experience of United Response, examples like that, of where providers have a real contribution to make to the development of people. So I've seen examples where perhaps a young man, a young lady has been supported by their parents most of their life, but the parents get to a point where they can't do that anymore. And the support is transferred to an organisation like United Response. And what we found is that that person can hardly do anything for themselves. But we kind of knew that they could, really. So there's been a process of bringing that out of people. And you know, clearly what has happened, again, for the right reasons, parents have been overprotective, tried to support people too much, and it takes a provider sometimes to come in and say, actually, this person is capable of more, can do more. And I was absolutely thrilled earlier on to hear the reflections from Shirley over there about see my abilities, you know, don't see my disability, see what I can do, focus on that. And that's what it's all about, really. So the provider can be a catalyst in that, I think. So I'm going to move on now to another area that might be of interest to you, which is the area of cost. Want to talk about cost a bit? Shall we talk about that? Yeah.
Good idea.
My impressions coming over to Australia was that you weren't quite in the state that we are in the UK. But you know, we've for the past couple of years we've been facing 20–25% reductions in central government funding, which have been passed on to local government, which of course is the instrument through which much of the funding of disabled support takes place. So that's of course been passed on to providers. Surprise, surprise. The local governments haven't got the money, but it's the provider who has to pay the bill for that at the end of the day. And there's a number of ways in which providers have responded to that. It can be a reduction in hours of support, it can be reductions in hourly rate that is charged. That usually means that it's a loss of surplus for a provider if you're a not-for-profit organisation, or a loss of profit if you're a commercial organisation. Or it can mean it's a reduction in management overheads. All of those have different dangers and consequences if you go down that approach. But my argument here is that there is a cost versus quality equation at work here. That's why I call it a value proposition. So I do believe that even in quite stringent financial situations, the provider can offer that value proposition. And United Response, for example, never ever claims to be the cheapest provider, so we would never go for a tender for work on the basis of being the cheapest. And like many other providers, they would go on the basis of this is a value for money proposition that they're making to you. And I think that's quite important to keep in your minds if you're faced with this kind of dramatic cost reduction. And if you take United Response as an example, for the past 5–6 years, it has maintained a very, very strong financial position compared to the other organisations who would be similar to it. A number of which are also doing well. And those that are doing well, I'm convinced of doing so because of adopting person-centred approaches. So I think having worked at that for a number of years, it's not the only element, but having worked at it for a number of years, they're able to create this value proposition that actually this stuff works. And if you go back to some of the things I was saying earlier, also, part of that value proposition is if you do person-centred stuff properly, enable people to use their abilities and do more, become more independent, actually the level of support can be less. And there are a number of examples I can think of where that has happened. So an organisation has said to a provider, if we use these person-centred approaches, provide the support in this way, this person becomes more independent, actually the bill to you will be lower. And that kind of works with those funding. It shouldn't be forgotten also that perhaps self-funders or other people are prepared to pay for quality. We know ourselves, don't we, that we will pay for quality. And that shouldn't be forgotten, I don't think. And I think that value proposition becomes more important as people take on individual budgets or individual service funds. And I tried to explain what I just said once to the head of commissioning of a local government organisation as part of my sort of crusade to get people to see that if you use person-centred approaches, you can actually reduce cost rather than increase cost if you do it properly. And this person was complaining to me about his lot as a local government official and saying how awful it was because they had to be so conscious of being sued by people who might be hurt by their staff or injured or whatever. And he was complaining to me about how awful it was to have these huge central government reductions in funding. So I just said that to him. I explained the story about my daughter and how giving her too much support actually doesn't help her. And I told him the story about her risk assessment at a respite care centre that she goes to, which said that she always must have 2 members of staff with her wherever she goes in the premises, and if they're going to give her a bath, she has to have 3 members of staff with her. And I said, that's crazy, absolutely crazy. I said, do what I've done with the people, come around to my house and watch Lucy walking around, and watch how many people there are with her, and then make your decision about that risk assessment and how many people you actually need to support her. And that might lead you to some conclusions about the cost of the service. It's dead simple, but it's just a different way of looking at things. But it's actually quite difficult, I think, for some people to get their mindset into that. If I give less support, I can actually do a better job, and it can cost me less. It's a really difficult conversation, actually.
It's not really dignified to have a bath with 3 people standing there either, is it?
Well, absolutely right. You know, it's just awful, isn't it? But it was a difficult conversation, I have to say. And I'm not sure I won it either. But I'm a serial complainer, I don't give up. You know, I keep going. Is everybody okay so far? Yeah, all right? Yeah. So, I do understand, of course, that there is a balance here. All of us have to balance risk versus cost. So we have to do that. It's part of our duties as providers. But I do think there is considerable scope. Hopefully I've shown that to you in a couple of examples I've given you, where providers particularly can be innovative, can be creative in the way that they provide support, and can demonstrate to those who are providing the money actually can be done differently and it can cost less. It's really important, I think. And for me, of course, the place that you start with that is with the person-centred tools. So where you start thinking about innovation and creativity is with things like working and not working for the person being supported. What's important to and what's important for them. That's the starting point, perhaps with a one-page profile of the person being supported to lead you into, so how could I do this differently? And the input of families to that is important. Hopefully you've seen that from my input with various people. But also the provider's input adds value as well. So what a provider brings to that conversation, I think, is the experience of all the other people that you support. And that's why I think things like stories are important in provider organisations, the sharing of knowledge, using things like the 4+1 questions review process, for example, to collect good practice and share that around the organisation. And for me, that's the big added value plus that provider organisations can bring. So just to summarise the first part of what I've been talking about, I'm going to talk later on about transforming to a person-centred culture, so I'm not going to say much about that now. When I talk later on, I'm going to show you some practical stuff that's been done around that. So I'll leave that for the time being. Hopefully I've got a message, started to get the message across to you as well, that embedding the person-centred tools in all of these approaches, which lead you to that personalisation of the service, is really important to me. What that means for a provider, I think, is that you do need to train everybody, and I mean everybody, in person-centred tools and approaches. That includes not only the direct support staff, but the leaders of the organisation, the backroom staff, everybody. I think that's really important, so you get that same culture across an organisation. And that, my favourite word to describe this is congruence. So for me, an organisation has to look congruent. So what the leader of an organisation does, what he says, how he behaves, needs to be the same as what's happening with the support workers and the people that they're supporting. It has to look and feel the same. If someone's coming into the organisation from outside as a potential customer, it has to look and feel the same, that person-centred approach. Does that make sense? So I'm just going to move on to talk a little bit about personalisation and individual budgets. From both perspectives, again, from a provider perspective, but also first from a parental perspective. My wife and I went through one of the original pilots of individual budgets, which was called Self-Directed Support, or In Control at the time in the UK. We were one of the pilot families that did this in one area of the country. And it's kind of similar to, I suppose, to what you're about to experience now. So the opportunity was there to have an individual budget which we would manage for our daughter. The issues that we saw with that, which hopefully might offer you some things to think about, was there was a real lack of understanding as to how that would actually work. So the people who were implementing it kind of was a pilot, and so it was meant to be kind of experimental, but actually they knew very little about how they were going to do it, and even less about how they would do it with the family and the person being supported. So the whole mechanism was very confused. They didn't explain really the benefits of doing it to us either. So you know, if you're going to change something as radical as the support for, in my case, our daughter, you kind of want to know the benefits, don't you? And they couldn't describe those to us. It was just like the government has said that personalisation and individual budgets are the way to go, so we as a local authority are doing it, let's all get on with it. It's more difficult than that for a family, I think, to help a person being supported make that decision. So in the end, we decided that we'd actually act as a coordinator of Lucy's package, which comes from 3 different sources. That was best for us. Doesn't mean it's not best for other people. And you know, the numbers of people with individual budgets now in the UK is growing steadily, I would say. It's not growing exponentially as it was first thought it would. So when it first started 5 or 6 years ago, people said this will just take off, so we need to be ready to accept all these hundreds and thousands of people who will want an individual budget. Didn't happen. But it is growing now, steadily.
That's what it's up to now.
As a proportion of the population, I don't know. But if I think in terms of where I worked at United Response, 5 years ago, we had a very small number of about 10 or 15 people who had some form of individual budget. So they either had an individual budget from the local authority or they funded themselves. That number now is about 200, 250, which is just over about 10% of the total number of people being supported. So it's significant, but it hasn't really taken off in the way that it was expected. It seemed to us also, and you may feel this, that this was, I've been a bit unfair, but it felt like a cost-cutting exercise. It felt like somebody might have been taking an opportunity to re-evaluate that link between need and provision. So the way this worked was, there was an assessment of need which gave you a ranking according to what services you needed to have, which was then related to what was called a RAS, a resource allocation system, which is effectively a table of money that had a link to this table of need. So if you were an E, you got that much money. And trying to get into, so how did you figure out then what that money was in that table? Was extraordinarily difficult, and I could never get to the bottom of that. I'm not sure the people who were doing it could either, to be honest. So that it just created that environment of, I'm really not sure about this, I'm not sure that they understand it or what's going on here. So in the end, as I said, we decided not to do it. But that's not to say that other people wouldn't find that acceptable, and a lot of people now do in the UK. I've also travelled down the road of personalisation for about 5 years as a sort of professional as well as a parent. And so I'll just give you a few thoughts on that from a provider perspective. One thing I would say is, if you're thinking about personalisation, going down that route, if you look in the appendices of the book, you'll find a couple of questionnaires, they are really, in there, called Progress for Providers. In the book are the original two, which the first of which was for an assessment of how you're doing as a provider on personalisation in general. So it's an assessment questionnaire, basically, where you would rate yourself against some criteria for how well you're doing. The second one of those makes that link to person-centred tools and techniques. So it's for managers. So that one allows managers to look at, in terms of delivering this personalisation through person-centred tools, how am I doing as a manager? So those two go together like that. There are now in the UK new versions of that. There's one for dementia and there's one for home care, which are being developed separately. Specific examples for those types of service. Quite useful, I would say, if you're just starting to get into this, or you're already into it and you want to measure progress. A useful tool to have a look at that as an organisation.
People were handed out the Progress for Providers on arrival,
okay.
So people have it on the table. Yeah.
Good, sorry. Good, sorry. Thank you for that. So have a look at that. It's quite detailed, and you might just want to pick out certain sections to have a look at. Also, you'll find that the content of that has been pulled and slightly adapted into questionnaires in each of the chapters of the book. So if you go through the book and have a look at that, you'll see there's information in there.
Can I just, we have used in New South Wales, we've used that Progress for Providers survey.
Yeah.
We developed one with Helen, and we've used it across the state. So, you know, we have exposure to that in Australia.
Okay,
so, yeah.
Good.
Just wanted to let you know that.
Good. Okay. So Progress for Providers, we're okay. That's fine. The other approach that I like to use, I call the customer journey. And this is an approach that has been used by a number of organisations in the UK. And it's essentially a roadmap of what happens to someone who's trying to interface with you as an organisation. So when not only United Response but a number of other organisations started to think about the journey of personalisation, if you like, what we did was to map out what it looked like for a customer to find a way through the organisation, from initially commissioning the service through all of the things that might happen between them and the organisation, through to perhaps terminating a contract with us. So, and it was just a way of looking at how easy is it for people actually to get into the organisation. So it can point you, for example, to things about your systems and processes that don't actually help if you're dealing with a parent like me, perhaps, who's got an individual budget and wants to get into your organisation. So invoicing might be a typical example that was definitely uncovered, which was a pretty tortuous process to get into the organisation, find out what's gone wrong with an invoice and why it went wrong, and what you can do about that. If that is a tortuous process for potentially hundreds of individual budget holders, the organisation is going to have a problem. So it leads you to look at those kind of areas and issues about the way you operate as a business, if you like, to look at your business processes. And I just happen to call it the customer journey, but it is no more than just identifying where do people need to interface with us and how easy is that for them to do, and then to re-evaluate the business process that you're looking at. Something that has been done by certainly United Response and other organisations. So, as I mentioned, for example, if you're an organisation supporting, as United Responses, now 2,000 people, and 200 of those, or roughly, as now individual budget holders, that's not too bad in terms of managing that financial process. If all 2,000 were individual budget holders, you can see the difference in what that would mean for the financial processes and the resources that would have to be put to that. I do think those aspects are quite important to understand. And there might be other areas as well, for example, from an HR perspective. You know, so people might want to get into your HR department to get help from them, possibly about employment legislation if they're employing their own staff or whatever. So lots of different aspects of how you run the business that I think you need to look at when you're going down this route.
We had a funny story after a merger experience, and we were going through some difficult times with families, and one of the meetings, one of the mothers stood up and she listed off, I think it must have been a dozen telephone numbers that she'd tried to make contact with the person that she felt was most directly involved in the management of the programs for her daughters. And whilst it caused a bit of a titter around the room, what have you, it was a bit embarrassing that something as fundamental as ringing the company up was so difficult for this individual person.
I've seen exactly that. You know, if people are ringing into an organisation like the one I worked at, they'll ring the central phone number and they'll say, I live in wherever, what's the local service? For me, who do I need to talk to? If you don't know, it sends a message, doesn't it, about how good is this organisation if they don't know where the services are? You know, they can't direct me quickly to the right place. It's just, it's simple, but it's really important, isn't it? It's really important. So just going back to thinking about those differences and how providers might want to look at things. I described earlier on when we were looking at individual budgets for our daughter, and I think it's useful to think about this from a provider perspective. What we found was that we were being told on the one hand you can have an individual budget and you can spend that pretty much as you want. The problem was we didn't know how we could spend it. So we didn't have any information about what was available, who provided it, were they any good, and you know, what might that cost us to actually do that, and was that a reasonable cost or not? None of that information was available. And that's an area, I think, that providers can think about what services are you providing. So it might be, for example, that an information service or a brokerage service would be really valuable to people like me who actually need to navigate their way through all of this, and providers in a great position because you know a lot of this stuff anyway. So I think that's important. I mentioned employing people earlier, so you know, a lot of people who are considering individual budgets are pretty daunted about the amount of employment legislation and other stuff that you have to do if you're employing people. So some help in that area from providers might be welcomed. And that's certainly something I've thought about before, is to offer just a back office type service, if you like, to people who have individual budgets or do it on their behalf. And that kind of expertise, I think, is quite rare, but providers have it. So it's worth thinking about whether that's of value to people. And last but not least, of course, I think, is just that relationship between the provider and the person being supported and their families. And that changes when the person being supported is paying the bill directly. There's more control in that situation by the person being supported. So if you really understand the person-centred approaches, can really get into understanding the needs of that person through using things like important to important for and one-page profile, you can strengthen that relationship and not have control of it, but have more influence over the way that it goes. And that's actually, I think, quite an important role for the provider to play, is to enable all of that conversation to happen. So, just to wrap up on the personalisation front, if I was to try and offer you a few sort of hints and tips around this one. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a guy called Ben Harrison, who is looks after personalisation for United Response in the UK, who incidentally is a real expert on this stuff. I'm not, but he is, and would be very happy for any of you to contact him for a conversation about some of this interested in more detail on it. So we chatted about what might help, and some of the things that we thought were that one of the problems with implementing this in the UK was an ownership issue. So it wasn't clear who actually owned this in the local government setup and who knew how to do it, and was ownership passing really from them to individuals or to providers? That was very, very unclear. So trying to sort that out early on would be quite important, I think. The other thing was about being pragmatic to the funding of this approach. I'd said earlier, for us it was very confused, and it seemed to us that it wasn't funded properly. So being able to explain that in a very pragmatic way is important. You also have to take a risk, I think. There is risk involved in this, and you have to let people do it. You have to let people have that responsibility for managing their own budget. And taking out bureaucracy, I think, is important. So one of the dangers, I think, of going down this personalisation route is that people actually don't let go of that control and build in layers of bureaucracy which end up costing more rather than less. And that's a real danger with this kind of approach, I think. If the funder still wants to have lots of reports and interventions in what's going on, it will never work. This is a different relationship. Some other things that are happening in the UK now around this sort of personalisation area, circles of support are attracting a lot more interest now. What I mean by that is attracting other people from the community, other unpaid people into that circle of support for an individual, and making use of that to work with an individual budget and get more value for money, if you like. So that's happening. I mentioned earlier on as well individual service funds. And I don't know if you're used to that expression, but this is a kind of halfway house from total funding by a local authority to an individual budget. In the middle, there is an individual service fund option where the provider manages that money on behalf of the individual being supported. Are you familiar with this approach? That's attracting a lot of attention now in the UK because it is a halfway house. It doesn't have some of those potential downsides for the funders of losing control, because there still is a relationship there. And it also helps because they're under such strenuous funding cuts from central government. It's another way of just moving some of that accountability, potentially bureaucracy, elsewhere to be handled. The other thing that's still happening is when this all first started off a few years ago, the prediction, as I said, was that it would really take off and lots of people would want to get into the marketplace. So there were some organisations set up virtual marketplaces, so websites basically, where providers would advertise their wares and people could go and effectively select a provider. That is still going, but not quite in the same volume. So if you look for an organisation on Google called Shop 4 Support, Shop 4, number 4 Support, that's an example of a virtual marketplace where providers can put up their services and I think prices as well. And that's still going on, and there are still a number of people using that as a way of finding their way into the marketplace and potential providers. So I'm coming to my conclusion now. I'll be pleased to know. Just a little bit more about person-centred approaches, I suppose, and the book that Helen and I wrote together. When we wrote that book, it was the first sort of premise that we set out was that the person-centred thinking tools, which were, as you know, primarily designed for interactions with disabled people, our premise was that actually that didn't matter. We could use those tools with anybody, staff, leaders of organisations, families, whoever. They could be applied across the board in a range of different situations in organisations, decision-making, planning, and so on. So that was our first premise. And the second premise was kind of related to that, which is actually that there shouldn't be any difference in the way that you use those tools and that thinking approach, whether you're dealing with someone you support or whether you're dealing with a member of staff. So the relationship part of that actually doesn't need to be fundamentally different in the approaches that you take. Now, to some people, using sort of tools and techniques that were designed for use with people being supported, using those with staff, for example, is a little bit unusual to some people. But I would say, well, why? Why is that? Why is that unusual? Why wouldn't you do that? So I'll just give you a few examples of some things that I would, perhaps phrases I would typically use in relation to people we support, that I think can be applied equally to staff, for example. So I often talk about seeing the whole person, and my friend over here sort of talked about some of that in her reflections as well. See the whole person, see abilities and not disabilities. I think you can do that with staff. So what we want to do with staff, for example, is we want them to bring their full range of talents and expertise to work, don't we? We all want that. We don't want them just to bring the bit that we've taught them how to do at work. We don't want them just to do the tasks. Particularly if you're matching staff for a person being supported, you want that full person, don't you? I think that's the same. That's the same as seeing the full person. Again, my friend over there talked about focusing on abilities and not disabilities. I think that's really important. And I think, again, you can apply that to relationships with staff. So, you know, we all do it as managers, don't we? We complain about someone who's not terribly competent and can't do certain jobs that we ask them to do. So we focus in on the bits that they can't do. So just imagine what it would be like, actually, if we took the different approach and said, I'm going to focus on what you really can do. And those bits that you're perhaps not so good at, that's my job to develop those and make you become better as an employee, as a person, as a member of staff. It's just thinking about that differently. But we do tend, don't we, to focus on what people can't do rather than what they can. Another area which is slightly more contentious is around the area of challenging behaviour. You know, if you're dealing with challenging behaviour, one of the things that is talked about there is don't just deal with what's presenting to you, actually deal with the triggers of that and try to understand what those are and then respond. And I think that's the same with staff as well. You know, if you've got staff who are constantly moaning or wanting to raise grievances about situations and so on, you need to look for why that is happening. So you need to get behind that behaviour, if you like. I call it challenging behaviour, it's not really, but you see what I mean. It's the same approach. So I would argue that if you, in your disciplinary and grievance processes, you need to reflect that same thinking of how you would deal with someone in that circumstance. And last but not least, paying attention to what is important to people as well as what is important for people. So understanding someone's one-page profile and what drives them as a person and their values and beliefs, I think is fundamental. In the same way as it is for people with sport, it is for staff, understanding that. So it's just a different way of thinking about how I would deal with, relate to members of staff. And just to finish off, I've talked a bit about United Response, and in an organisation like that supporting 2,000 people, like many of your organisations, there isn't a product as such. You don't make stuff, but what you do is create value. You create value for the people being supported. And the reason, one of the big reasons that I got involved with writing this book is because I think that value of an organisation like that is all in what I call those little moments between a support worker and a person being supported. That's where the value is. It's about that time when something happens between those two people that stops something not working suddenly work, or it really responds to something that's important to that person being supported. And it's all in those moments between the support workers and that supported person. That's the value of any organisation like that. So the rest of us who are working in HR or finance or wherever it may be, our job is to align and be congruent with that support worker to enable them to make those moments the most effective they possibly can be. And that's what I believe is the driver behind embedding person-centred approaches and practices right across an organisation, rather than just at that sharp end. Because if you make the organisation line up behind those support workers, it just feels right to me. And everything you're doing is focused then on that person being supported. And that for me is the prime value of an organisation providing those kind of services. So the more that an organisation can display that congruence, the happier I would be. And you can do this in a number of different, so here's a few thoughts. Implementing one-page profiles, if you haven't already done that, that's one of my favourites. Thinking about your policies and procedures, so looking at those and thinking about, do they really support that support worker and their management teams, the teams that they work with, or do they get in the way? And I mentioned yesterday, at the workshop we had yesterday, one of the things we found out in United Response through a Learning and Reflection Day was actually we had a great person-centred culture with the people we support, but our organisation was still incredibly rules-bound and rules-driven. And the people over here were getting so frustrated because they were trying really hard to do the stuff they wanted to do, but all the rules and regulations were getting in the way. So we had to change that to enabling them to do that and not get in the way. And people that they rang in finance or HR were actually more helpful than trying to stop them doing things because the rules said that. So it's a way of thinking that's different. So you can do that. And at the management level, you can use things like good day, bad day, for example. Is another simple person-centred tool. Managers to understand how that support worker can or cannot achieve what I described earlier in those moments that they have. Understanding, is someone feeling good about work today or bad about work today is a way of doing it. So I think if you're a provider, translating some of those tools and practices into your own business terms, asking staff to do a one-page profile, seeing what you learn from that, in terms of managing those people, looking at that at an organisational level, so reflecting on things like your vision, your mission, the values of the organisation. Again, we talked yesterday about creating a one-page strategy for an organisation that displays all of those things about how you are as an organisation. And I'll show you something like that later on in my later presentation. And using the working together for change process, which I referred to earlier on as learning and reflection, I think is a very powerful way of grabbing all that information from the people at the coalface, as I call it, and translating it through the organisation to the senior team and into the business planning process. So just a few thoughts about how you might go about doing that. The key, of course, is keeping that person we support at the centre of everything that we do. And that, for me, if you just do that, a lot of this becomes easy. Thank you.
I'm interested as well in how United Response worked with other providers and exposed your organisation to the culture of other organisations, and what learning there is from the UK about how providers worked together and collaborated together, particularly as it transitioned towards a more marketised environment, and so that how that tension between collaboration and competition was resolved, and/or how that work was facilitated by the likes of the Social Care Institute for Excellence or other government bodies or PIN bodies or leadership within the sector by maybe some of the larger organisations? Yeah,
at a number of different levels, I think is the answer. Organisations like FaHCSIA tend to get involved at quite a high level in terms of sort of standard setting, things like competencies for the profession and all that kind of stuff. So they have an involvement there, I guess, and clearly have been influenced by the move towards person-centeredness and all of those kind of tools. There are a number of collaborative bodies across the UK of various types, so don't ask me to name them all, but there are a number of collaborative bodies dealing, some in the housing sector, for example, which various organisations do a bit of, so we'll join in that. There are organisations like the NCVO, who are very much an industry body, if you like, in the sense of providing some of those professional advice, standards, guidance, lots of policies and procedures and so on, so that's there. There is an organisation called the VODG, the Voluntary Organisations Directors Group, where lots of CEOs, MDs of disability organisations collaborate together in sharing lots of this information. So there's lots of those sort of sector-wide type activity going on. There's also a couple of other levels. There's lots of contact really between various members of staff in the organisations and their peers in other organisations. So all sorts of conversations going on at CEO, MD, HR director level. So for example, I was part of what's called a Charities HR network, where I was collaborating with a range of people across all sorts of different voluntary sectors, and another group where we had just social care organisations talking about the things that were applicable to us, as well as sort of one-to-one contact with people in other organisations. So on all sorts of stuff like HR policies, for example, or on IT systems to help us measure outcomes, and so really lots and lots of dialogue going on. Also, Helen Sanderson is quite good in facilitating some of this stuff as well. So she's very good at connecting people together, and she'll tell organisations, do you know what Dimensions are doing? Do you know what McIntyre are doing? Why don't you go and talk to so and so? So there's lots of that networking going on.
So you're finding that there's still plenty of sharing, essentially, because that's one of the concerns.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, obviously, there's always that edge, isn't there? Of actually, these are competitors, but it's when you get behind it, it's not real. Actually, it's just a bit of a facade, I think. And I've never seen any real barriers to people sharing stuff and learning from each other. And there isn't one organisation who's got the right answer for everything. It just isn't. So it's essential really that we do find out who's doing the good things and try and connect with them. And there is a lot of it going on. And as I say, Helen's very good at grabbing a lot of that, and various forums that she runs, for example. There is a person-centred organisations forum, for example, which was built out of a workshop last October where we had 50 or 60 different organisations come along, and we talked to them about the book and created a forum for people to share the tools and techniques and the developments that they're making with the tools. So some quite interesting stuff there, where people have taken our ideas and developed it further into sort of practices appropriate for their organisations. So lots of that going on.
Stephen, just want to talk about relationships with families. For our organisation, and others may be different or the same, we seem to have two sort of different relationships. One which is an informal relationship where families tap into what's going on for their family member in whatever program it might be, in a home or in a program. Seems to be quite natural and normal, have an interface with the direct support staff that's direct, and seems to be on the terms of the family member, that I want to talk to so-and-so and they're free to do so, and I want to have an engagement with my son or daughter or cousin or whatever whilst they're in the program for a day or something like that. But when it comes to dealing with the company at a more formal level, we tend to be much more reserved. We tend to, for instance, I'm involved in a consultative group right now for a particular project, and so there's confidentiality statements. There's a statement that enshrines that they're aligned in their thinking with the thinking of the organisation. That there's all this kind of formal stuff where the organisation's saying, ostensibly, that if you want to engage with us formally as a family member, you need to have an alignment with the values of the organisation. If you don't have it, you need to go away and do something else. Have you encountered that, or are we struggling with some form of relationship that needs to become more mature, do you think, in what I'm describing to you?
I've not encountered that, I have to say. I mentioned earlier that there's quite a lot of family involvement in United Response, and I'm sure in other organisations as well, but it's a quite an informal level. We don't have those kind of agreements with people. So, as an example, United Response is split into 4 divisions across the UK, and each of those has what used to be a divisional management team, and has now become a divisional leadership team. And the reason the title was changed was because people we support and their families were invited just to come along and take part, so they didn't have to sign up to anything. There was obviously some sort of volunteering process or some sort of informal selection process as to who wanted to come and how many people we could accommodate, obviously for practical reasons, but there are no real sort of formal barriers to that. Similarly, if people we support come to things like the Diverse Voices meeting that I mentioned, no particular requirements there, they can just come and they can contribute whatever they wish. So I never really thought about what you're suggesting, which is trying to put that onto some sort of formal agreement basis. I think it would be kind of countercultural, really, to me anyway, to do that. But I think you're right, though. I've described the relationship I want to have as a family member with the people who are providing services for my daughter. But every person's going to be different, aren't they? There are other people who just want to have a very light touch, whereas someone like me really wants to be interfering all the time. So, and I've certainly been told back off, on occasions, by poking too much into what was considered to be protected territory of some people. But it was done in a nice way, without any kind of formal agreement or anything like that. So, and I'm okay with that. So yeah, it's not a route I would take personally. But
any other questions at this stage?
Yeah, I suppose I'm asking, I think a question, but maybe it's more for an observation. I feel at the moment the work, so my job is working primarily with boards and at the governance level and CEOs about, embracing the change that really needs to happen. And one of the things I think we're getting into at the moment with organisations is really relinquishing that authority and control and moving from what I call a management structure thinking to what you described as a leadership concept. And can you share with us, was that some of what had to happen in the space, that from letting go and allowing self-direction and people to make the decisions, and when there are, for example, perhaps a philosophical not quite connecting with how we might want to do business, how you then just need to step back from that. In fact, if we're truly self-directed, then how you might interface with it. Can you just sort of...
I mean, I think you're right to describe it as letting go. That's precisely what has to happen. And I know from our conversation earlier, one of your areas is change management. So I'm sure most of us are aware that change doesn't happen overnight, and not everybody does it together either. You do need some sort of catalyst to make things happen, I think. And I can think of a number of examples where just one person somewhere who had the right sort of level of authority and influence just did something. without necessarily having permission as an organisation to do that, just did it. And not everybody thought that was a good idea, but sometime later, surprise, surprise, they all join in. And that would certainly be the case around the sort of transition from a traditional management approach to more of a leadership and engaging approach. That certainly was the case. There were some early adopters who thought, this is just a no-brainer, we've got to do this. You know, why would we not want to involve people we support and their families in at least getting information from them, if not making decisions? Why would we not do that? And got on with it. And then spread that to other levels of the organisation that they had influence over. And then, you know, other people saw that sometime later, what was going on, and thought, well, we should be doing that as well, and moved on as happens in change.
And that's really hard work, isn't it?
Yeah, so there was, I think what probably wouldn't work is some sort of organisational edict that said, we're all going to do it like this now.
No.
I just don't think that would work. But giving people the space, actually, to say, here's the principles to which we're working, here are our values, here's our vision and mission, and really making that absolutely clear, kind of encourages people to take some chances and try things, and that's what I've seen happen, where people do have absolute clarity that the organisation is going in that direction. It becomes kind of okay to take a few risks about getting there, and I like that as an approach, rather than, I don't think it will ever work if the CEO says, from tomorrow we're all going to be person-centred. It doesn't work, does it? It doesn't work.
Okay.
But it's evolutionary.
Yeah.
But it does work. It does work, and it grows as well.
Great. Stephen, thank you. And I hope that we will be doing a second presentation at the level. So, could you thank Stephen for this presentation? So I'm just going to bring the questions up. Wish to make to people with disabilities, family members and staff. So is there something that's come out of the listening that touches this concept of commitment for you? The second question was about a commitment that's a major leap forward. And you can see there it says risk, not risk management, just something that would be a major leap forward. And then the last one was, is there a commitment now that you would let go? So just the facilitator, if you could, commitment, maybe something that you would lean forward for, or is there something that you'd be prepared to let go? And then we'll have some feedback. Claire will wrap that up. So I think we should be finished this no more than 10 minutes to a quarter of an hour, and then we'll have more tea.
And then it's
okay, folks, can we just feed back? And in feeding back, if each table could, if your discussion has broken down into commitment to people, anything about a risk you might take, or just risk enablement or whatever, and then the last one is postponed, that'll be easier for Claire to graph them up. So can we come to the back table? Who would be reporting there? So thanks. If we can just still focusing on the back table.
Okay, so we did we focused on the first and second questions. So the first question, so promises and commitments. So we said that we'd be committed to spreading the word.
Okay, great.
We also said we'd be good listeners, and then from that we'd respond to like the action of whatever it is. We'd be committed to taking the journey together, along with our clients that we're supporting. And then for the second one, the risk or major shift, we've put a big one is to like letting go.
Okay.
And sharing the power, and then giving it away as well. And we also said that failure is a good thing, so accept that failure could happen. And yeah, that's what we had.
Great, good. Thank you very much.
So it's quite beautifully done.
Yes. Perfect. Well done. Thanks. Over to this table.
We sort of also refocused on the first two questions, and we did struggle a little bit with that third one around postponing or unwilling to take. We kind of got 60% sort of there, but not really.
Okay.
So in terms of the first one, which is looking at the commitments, we had some discussion around that right amount of support, just the right amount of support, just enough support, optimising that. And that really linked back to starting from that strengths and ability point, which also led us to thinking around, stepping back and giving some room for people to actually learn and observe what it is that they're able to do, and then what sort of support they may need through that. Under risk, I guess all of that obviously led to a different approach to looking at risks. And we had some discussion around the ownership of that, devolving that out, what that might mean, looking at boundaries, how to have those discussions. We looked at making sure that how we approach risks from an individual point of view is based on that strengths and ability concept. And then we just sort of started an interesting bit of discussion about how you might look at organisational risk in doing things in a different way. So if you're making a commitment to do something in a different way, in this case it was looking at maybe personal organisations, then how to have that risk discussion at a management or a board level. And I was sort of thinking that sometimes the risk is about, it's actually not a greater risk, and sometimes that's where we automatically jump, because this is a much bigger risk, when maybe it's just a different risk. So there's still something there we need to have that conversation about. And my colleagues made a commitment to jump in if I'd forgotten anything. Is there anything that we needed to add? And yeah, we didn't quite get to the postponement.
No, the postponement is a block question, but it's a bit of a challenging question, isn't it? Postponing a commitment. But maybe we have some commitments that we've been thinking about, and with some reflection and hearing a catalyst speaker, we don't think that's on the right track, so we'll postpone it. So we've got next breakfast, we can continue to think on that. So, Miriam, is it? No, Megan.
I think repeating what somebody else said, listening. Basically, what does the individual, he or she want? And effectively that means letting go. So let's get back to the basics for the individual, what he or she wants. It's letting go and educating families to let go. I think that's what was brought up in the presentation. I think that's a really important point. Now, Kylie actually raised using the person-centred tools for and with staff, and that was discussed in the presentation as well. But I think that that particular principle and that set of tools we need to use to engage the whole team in an organisation. So management team, the organisation, including the board and staff, who really are the basic people that you need to connect with the resident on a daily basis. Is that it? Did you want to do the risk next? Yes? No? Oh, thank you. I'm tangled. Okay, risk, we talked about having real conversations of change. So moving along the pathway, the roadmap of change. And what will this, Pauline actually brought this up, what would this actually look like? So a real version of what it would look like. So let go of the change risk lens, letting go of corporate governance issues, risk issues, etc. And basically getting out of the way of the new direction and positive nature of the change to enable the residents. So if you really don't want to get on board, just really being cut and dry and just getting out of the way. And unfortunately, we didn't get to the third question.
So, thank you. Rich discussion, great reflection on your presentation, Stephen. So, Claire, would you just like to feedback what you think we've got from those three?
So in terms of commitment to people with disabilities and staff and families and the community and people that we support, there was lots of talk about spreading the word and educating families and really listening to what people want. There was comment about optimising the idea of providing just enough support, not too much support, and what Stephen was talking about before, about increasing that harm. And using person-centred tools, not just with the people that you support, but also with staff. Commitment, what commitments might people take that could be a risk? About letting go, and that's letting go of ideas, but also letting go of staff and people that are not committed to the change. And there are lots of conversations to be had with staff and with people that are supported. There needs to be some sort of ownership of the risk and identification of boundaries. And it's also okay to accept that everything won't work out the first time and that failure might happen. And there needs to be a sharing of power.
Great, thanks very much, Claire. That was, I think, very congruent using one of Stephen's terms with Stephen's presentation and the discussion around the table. So thank you very much for participating in that. We'll have morning tea now, and then if we could come back for 11. Maybe in beginning. If I could just that Stephen ran a one-day workshop at Sydney University yesterday, and members from some of the organisations are attending. Some people here today are attending, and it was very positively received. If you have any other members of the organisation that are particularly involved with change, I'm trying to remember what else we were covering.
Human resources and teamwork. Okay. I'll try and go through this fairly quickly. Just want to try to squeeze this in this morning to cover some of the more practical aspects. And this presentation was actually designed first for a slightly different audience, and it's about change. So it's some of the more practical elements of how change on a fairly large scale has been brought about in social care. I've been involved in sort of change management for quite a long time, both within and without social care. These are just some of the big sort of changes that I've been through in my life. Some with Roundtree, some with GlaxoSmithKline. So some pretty big sort of international type change projects, national type change projects of the nature that you see up here. And also my other big change, of course, was moving out of what was actually manufacturing into social care, move into the Commission for Social Care Inspection, as I mentioned earlier on. Which led me into what I was talking about earlier on, which is the culture change around new ways of working in people with people with disabilities. All of those change projects had a number of things in common. So just about all of them had some sort of clear reason for change. So one of the things that was on that previous slide was about rapid implementation of IT systems, for example. That happened in the pharmaceutical industry because the United States decided that current IT systems could no longer provide adequate proof of the safety of medicines being shipped to the United States. you can imagine the impact of that on the pharmaceutical industry meant you better move fast to do something about this. So an absolutely clear reason for change. The other thing was there was always sponsorship of some type. So there was someone in the organisation somewhere who was, if you like, championing or sponsoring that change to occur. And there was always a sense of urgency, so something had to happen fairly quickly, like the change in IT systems, for example. Also, one of those that I had up there was happened in quite a long time ago in Roundtree, where very, very quickly there was a change in the retail market, and there was the emergence of some large supermarket groups who said, we don't want you to distribute to us the way you used to, we want it done slightly differently, and we're going to pay you 10% less for your product now, because we're the biggest customers you've got and we can bully you around. So overnight, virtually, the entire distribution system had to be changed. It took us actually about 6 months to do it. But that's what I mean by a sense of urgency, that there's some driving force that has to happen there. Also, a feature of these big projects and the stuff that we went through in social care was what I've called tenacity and perseverance. I think it relates to sponsorship, but I've always seen someone who has driven through that change and overcome resistance in all its shapes and forms, and being very tenacious in doing that. So not accepting resistance in a sense, and just carrying on dealing with that in a calm and collected way, but just carrying on dealing with it. Very important, I think, is an infrastructure that is to see the change through, and I'll come back and describe a bit more about that in the social care example in a minute. And there were lots of people affected. The one that was different was, of course, the last big change that I've been experiencing in social care. And these are some of the differences, I think. There were definitely some people there with this passion for the vision. Now, in terms of implementing person-centred approaches in United Response, that's probably been happening at a pace for the last 5 or 6 years, I would say. But actually, that passion for a vision started with Sue Sayre, the chief executive, in 1972. And she would say that that's been maintained for 40 years, and what they're doing now is merely building on that same passion that existed, providing support services for 2 people in Kent, in England, 40 years ago. And that is real passion, I think. Optimistic discontent is a Michael Small term. Have you come across that before? He uses it just to say, it's very common in change management, isn't it, that you have to have people dissatisfied with the current state, otherwise they won't move to somewhere else. Michael describes that slightly differently, as saying, yes, you need the discontent, but you also need the optimism about the future to be moving to a better place, and that's kind of common sense, I guess. There was most definitely, in this circumstance, a very powerful vision of that future, that optimism, what it actually meant to move from, for example, from very traditional institutionalised support for people to supporting people in their own homes, in supported living environments, and using person-centred tools. There's a very powerful vision of that through the organisation. And it did build on this 40 years of history of an existing culture of bringing about that kind of change. There was also real engagement of staff in particular, but also, as I mentioned earlier, families and other people associated with the people we support and the people support themselves. We didn't see that happen to anywhere near the same extent in some of those other changes that I saw there. And that has really, in my view, been one of the big things that has pulled the change through the organisation, as having that real engagement, because that's linked people into the vision part of this. Providing the tools is all about training, really. It's about equipping everybody in the organisation, as I mentioned earlier, with the knowledge of how to use person-centred tools, and then setting them free to do that in the most appropriate way for the people that they're supporting. Very important too that leaders model that. So, as I mentioned to some of the folks yesterday, if you walked into United Response and saw the way that the managing director runs the meeting of the directors team, you would see a positive and productive meeting, which is one of the person-centred tools and techniques, practices. You would see that actually happening. And that's really important that that happens. And when we go out into the country, I used to go out into the country and invite people to things like the Diverse Voices meeting, you would see that being modelled by the leaders of that meeting, so that people saw it's embedded in the organisation. Also, there's this issue about cascaded local leadership, and what do I mean by that? When the programme of implementing person-centred practices began in United Response, it relates to this kind of infrastructure for change, really, that the leadership of that was cascaded to separate leadership teams within each division who were made up of a cross-section of people. So it wasn't just the divisional leadership team, it was other people who had a passion for doing this. And they formed a leadership team locally within the division, and they were accountable for the progress of that. Obviously reporting back to some kind of management team somewhere, but they actually took the lead on it. And very, very important was this message to the organisation that it's okay to try things. There is risk associated with that, but it's okay to take those risks. We'll accept error, provided you've thought it through in a sensible way. And again, I mentioned yesterday in the workshop, there was a stamp of support that was designed to say to people, if you've taken a risk, you've thought it through, it's a reasonable risk to take with someone, we won't let you down, we'll support you in that. These definitions here, I won't go through all of these, but these are a straight lift from the Person-Centred Organisations book. So you'll see things up there that won't surprise you about the focus on people support, about decision making as close as possible to the people being supported, about leaders and managers embedding those person-centred practices with staff and so on. Some more here, culture of respect. Of course, you would expect a culture of respect and trusting people, wouldn't you, in a person-centred organisation. The third bit of accountability, I think, is quite interesting, and we're beginning to start a conversation over here as to what gets postponed. One of those questions earlier, and it's the accountability bit that is the difficult area, I think, here, because once you start implementing person-centred tools, you have to respect people to do that in the most appropriate way. You have to trust them to get on with it. There's often a bit of difficulty around that accountability area. You know, where are my boundaries? What am I allowed to do and not allowed to do? You know, if I make a decision, am I really accountable for that or not? And that's quite a difficult area, I think, in terms of just explaining to people, if we give you the tools, if we give you the freedom to act, then actually when you act, you are accountable for that. And that's often a difficult conversation. Obviously, person-centred value is important. Next one talks about ongoing learning and continuous improvement. A lot of the way that we suggested using the person-centred tools is as continuous improvement tools. When I first saw these, having come from GlaxoSmithKline, I was very used to some sort of Japanese manufacturing techniques, which are all about continuous improvement and how you make cars better and all that kind of stuff. And some of them are quite complicated and sophisticated, really. The thing I noticed was that actually you could replace every one of those with one of these person-centred tools, which are much more simple to use and got you to the same answer. Continuous improvement, things like 4+1 questions and so on, doing those kind of reviews using that tool, or using working, not working, very much a key feature of person-centred culture. And the ongoing learning part, I think, is really important as well. One of the big differences, I think, between the change I saw here and elsewhere is around that ongoing learning piece. In a number of the other changes that I've been through elsewhere, people forgot about the learning and development piece. They forgot about the training bit. And actually, as a result, there were some issues and problems with implementation of those projects and those changes. I'm not saying there weren't issues and problems with implementing person-centred approaches, but actually, if I was to describe this change, it has been really a learning-led change. So it's been about people being trained in the tools and then learning as they've gone on more and more about how those tools work. And that's pulled the change through the organisation rather than it being pushed through the organisation by some sort of management effort, if you like. And that's really important. And a lot of the modern thinking about change management is that kind of learning-led approach is now by far the most effective way of getting change in organisations. And I talked earlier on about the business development part and organisational change being driven, as I gave the example, by learning reflection processes within United Response, and that being built into the business planning process and visible there as objectives and strategies. If you read that, all of that, but that's on one page, if you like, an expression of the culture of United Response and the way it wants to work. So, you know, a common definition of culture is the way we work around here, or the way we do things around here. So it's not coincidental that's the title of this. But you can see it on here. You know, it expresses the important things around values, and then gives people some guidance on how they're to implement those values through listening, organising, reviewing, and not surprising that the person we support is at the centre of that. So that was quite a powerful tool in sending out messages to people about this is the way that we do things around here. And you'll see this a lot around the walls and offices and places in United Response. It's simple, but it's just a repeated message of this is the way we do things, this is the way we do things. So some things that I think do work. I mentioned earlier that passion for the vision. That definitely works, and I'll give you an example of that, of the sponsorship element of that. When the training on the person-centred tools first started in United Response, Bob Tyndall, the managing director, went to that launch personally, used some person-centred tools in the presentation that he used to introduce that training session, which was for about a couple of hundred people initially. So was very, very visible in sending that message out to a lot of people. This is how I'm going to do things, and this is the direction that we're going. It was a really powerful message, and of course he got then 200 disciples who went off and spread that message for him. The support and infrastructure, I mentioned the leadership team part of that earlier on in the divisions. The other part of that infrastructure was local coaches teams who had a sort of extra level of training in the use of person-centred tools and supported local support workers in implementing that. So they would coach and help them through applying the tools. There was also obviously some additional infrastructure around training the trainers and support, for example, from Helen Sanderson's organisation to see that through. Some other things that we did, we used person-centred tools like matching in the recruitment processes and in some of the systems that supported that. Why is that important? Well, we wanted to make sure that the feedstock coming into the organisation, right from the beginning when they first interacted with us, were seeing that this is how we behaved. So they were recruited in a person-centred way. Kind of obvious that that's how life is going to go on if it starts there. People we support were involved in roles and competencies design, so that we made sure that that was tuned into what was needed by them. Staff also took part in that. We developed this process called Developing Excellence, which is a performance management process. So it's a supervision process, a one-to-one process, and we built into that person-centred tools like one-page profiles, like working, not working, and so on, so that when the staff sit down with their boss to have that performance conversation, it's using the same tools and techniques as we use with the people we support, and they recognise that. And I've already mentioned a number of different ways in my talk earlier on about how people we support and families were involved at a number of different levels, from local meetings right up to board meetings. There's a lot of work around communities, so encouraging support workers, starting with the matching staff process and knowing what contacts they had in their local communities to get out there, find people who could increase circles of support, find people who would work with us to move that presence to contribution curve forward for the people that we're supporting, find activities where people we support could join in and contribute to the local communities. One element of that was the use of something called time banking. You familiar with time banking? Yeah, some nod, some not. Time banking is a process that United Response got into very early, working with other people, a local authority usually, but people in the community, to do what the title suggests, which is various different people put time into a bank and provide services to each other free, but you're just putting in hours. And so lawyers, for example, would provide support for people who needed some legal services. People that we supported would perhaps go and do some gardening for someone or help them moving house or whatever it may be. So people we support were engaged in that community by giving their time, their hours, in return for other things. It's not terribly common in the UK, but it is becoming more prevalent now as a way of engaging, particularly in communities which are less prosperous, where something needs to catalyse the community to come together. Good technique for that. Consultation processes, I personally think, are really, really important to support this effort. And in United Response, the consultation process is not with a trade union body. It's just a staff body made up of volunteers, people who volunteer to represent their colleagues. And there is a national committee and there are local committees as well of people who talk from a staff point of view about how things are going. And we changed the way that we did that. So when I first joined, it was very much a sort of tea and biscuits and fire escapes type conversation. We changed that into a real business conversation. We used person-centred tools and techniques for running the meetings. We told people about how the organisation was doing financially and otherwise. We talked to them about equality and diversity, how we were doing on that, and a whole range of different sort of standing subjects, learning and development, health and safety, etc., etc., as a way of bringing people right into the running of the organisation. So, for example, every major policy procedure that my team wrote in HR went past these folks to have a look at, comment on, and we actually did listen to what they said, and we changed policies and procedures as a result of their feedback. So we deliberately made that meaningful so that the staff felt engaged in running the business as well. And I think it's pretty fundamental to this kind of change. Why it's important, I think, is because we were, further down this list, you'll see something about well-being and absence management. Sickness absence was a big problem. We wanted to deal with that, obviously, for a primary reason being that it affects the people we support. What we knew was the people we support, the biggest problem was consistency, not having the same people coming to support them every day. So people were absent through sickness, or we had turnover or whatever. Really, really big problems. So we wanted to address those. And having an effective consultation process allowed us to say to the staff, this is a big problem. It's a big problem, not because it's costing the organisation money, but because it's affecting the people we support. So we're able to send a cultural message to them all the time about why we needed to change things like that. And they bought into that. We never had conversations about, you're only doing this because it's costing you money. We always had conversations about, we really must get this better because it's affecting the people that we support, and we can't have that. And actually the people who were representing the staff are much more vociferous about what they called people who were swinging the lead than we ever were. they really got into that and started tackling people who were doing that. We took also a person-centred approach on that, which was very much about not wanting to beat people up for being sick, but actually understanding why that was occurring, looking at the working parts for them, looking at the important 2 parts, the important 4 parts for them, which could be all sorts of different things, and dealing with that root cause rather than just dealing with the symptom, which is not being at work. So it's very much a cultural message going on there, the way that we were talking about that. Talked about equality and diversity, diverse voices earlier on. There were a comprehensive set of learning and development programs that supported all this. So a vast range of offerings in different ways, through e-learning, through face-to-face, through coaching, through all sorts of different ways of getting to people, and again understanding the way that they learnt and what they needed to do, supported by the Developing Excellence process as well. So a very, very integrated approach to learning and development. And that perseverance thing again, just keeping at it in everything that we did. It was just, the reason we're doing this is because it's about the people we support. It's because it's about the people we support. Just keeping on repeating that. I guess you're familiar with all of these? Yeah? Know all those? So I don't need to go through those. Those are I just picked out some of the key ones that we used. Don't need to dwell on that, you're familiar with that. We also supported those tools with trying to measure things to death, really, because the big issue was always how do you know? Earlier on I saw on one of the slides that John O'Brien is coming to talk to you. John O'Brien is actually quite sceptical about person-centred approaches, and he came to visit us in United Response a couple of times, and that was his question: how do you know? How do you know this stuff's actually doing any good? Awkward question, really, because it is actually quite difficult to prove, and it's a bit of an act of faith, to be honest with you. So we tried to find, prompted by John, we tried to find lots and lots of different ways of proving that we were making a difference. One of those is the way we work. I've named that wrongly. I'm describing a process that was used annually, whereby our practice leadership team, the people who, the clues in the title, they led on the best practice to apply in the organisation, go around the services and look at the level of engagement of people. So they have tools and techniques for seeing whether people are meaningfully engaged in activities. And there's an annual report about that, which is usually for about 20% of the services per annum. And it was benchmarked about 5 years ago. So it's a really detailed tool of measuring that level of engagement and whether people are getting active support or not in the services. So that's a key one. Obviously we use person-centred planning tools for measuring progress with individuals, 4+1 for example. The visual office was just something that we invented to just hold a mirror up to people to what was really happening. So there's about 45 different measures in that. Just not for everybody to look at every one, but just to find one that was of interest to them, like turnover for example. Look at that, we've got massive turnover in the service. Why is that? Why is that? How's that affecting the people we support? Just doing that all the time. We have health and safety audits going around looking, part of that is looking at the application of person-centred tools. So when I get a health and safety report from my health and safety manager, we'll have a section in it that says this is how I think people are applying person-centred tools, particularly in relation to risk assessments. So are they using a person-centred approach to doing a risk assessment and putting control measures in support plans and so on? That's measured. Do lots of after action reviews, learning logs, another tool to record what we've learned from that, and so on and so forth. Policy check, as I mentioned earlier, and the National Users Panel is a group of people we support who advise the Board of Trustees on the way things should be done. And that is usually some of the people who are quality checkers. These are some quotations from, actually from Suzanne and Bob Tingle. Suzanne is the Chief Executive of United Response. So I just asked her, tell me why you think this has worked. And these were her answers. And some interesting stuff in there, I think. And you can see near the bottom that concept I mentioned a couple of times of act reasonably and we will support you. So this was just to answer my question off the cuff. That's one of the first ones she came out with. So you can see how embedded that is in the culture of the organisation. But the CEO is actually saying that straight off the bat, that's the way we behave around here. That's what we do. I think that's again, it's quite a powerful message to the organisation, and people know that she believes that. They know what she does. So I mentioned a lot of those on there. So last one, in summary, this is what I think works. You wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that if you focus on the people we support, the customer if you like, that's the prime thing. Lots of training and coaching definitely works, as I said earlier. Learning led, pull it through the organisation in that way by people at the coalface, using the tools, learning from that, sharing the knowledge, feeding that back into the organisation through learning logs and loops. That works. Integrating the policies, I think, is a critical part of this. So it just so happened that when I was there, I was responsible for human resources, learning and development, health and safety, and quality. So that was quite nice. So I could get people to integrate all this stuff and start feeding in person-centred approaches, person-centred language, person-centred style in the way that they behaved as well. And start to just counteract that conflict between person-centred culture and rules. That never works. That's what that was about. Important too that this sings through your corporate plan, I think. So it would be strange, wouldn't it, if you were trying to implement a person-centred culture, but actually your annual operating plan or business plan or your corporate plan said totally different things. And that's really important, I think. If you're really going to convince people that person-centredness is singing through your organisation, it has to start at the corporate plan so people can pick that up and say, actually, yes, I see that's what they're about. Then they can go and check by looking at what actually happens in the organisation. And provided the two are, use the word again, congruent, you'd be okay, I think. But I personally think that's really important. One of the things I did in United Response was actually to change the way that the operating plan was written. So it used to be written in very conventional language, as you would write a business plan. If you looked at it, the one I did 2 months ago, it's written in person-centred language using person-centred tools. So instead of, for example, having a SWOT analysis, as you would, wouldn't you, if you were writing a business plan, it has a working, not working. And it has what we're pleased about, what we're concerned about. It has, for the future, in terms of our strategies, what's important to and important for the people we support, the organisation, and so on. Simple, isn't it? It's the same content, it's just presented in a different way. And that does send a message to people, I think, to say, look at the way this is written. If they're writing a business plan like that, that must mean that they're serious about this, mustn't they? So I'd think about that one as a technique. I have to say, it's a bit of a challenge to get your fellow directors to agree to doing that, because it's a bit strange. But I was so pleased the second time we did it. One of my fellow directors said, you know, I never thought this would work, but it does.
That's great. Do you have to convince your trustees, or your board, the boards are, or the CEO have a lot of work to get them to
convince them of what?
That this is the way that the organisation needs to work, and all of the documentation and needs to look different than perhaps it had previously in terms of strategic plan, business plan.
I don't think we ever had to convince them about being person-centred and taking that approach. We were very, very fortunate, I have to say, that Professor Sue's reputation, particularly in being a leading person in all the things she'd done around supported living and all of that in the last 40 years. We're also very fortunate in the selection of the Board of Trustees. We had a guy called Jim Mansell, who unfortunately died last year. Jim was one of the trustees of United Response, and he was instrumental in promoting that different way of doing things for people with disabilities, particularly people with learning disabilities. So he was a real driving force with the Board of Trustees, and just saying, we've got to do this differently. We've got to engage with people. And the way we work evaluation that I mentioned earlier was done with his organisation, which was the Tizard Centre at Kedge University. We're really into understanding meaningful engagement of people we support. So there was a, if you like, it wasn't that hard because there was a real interest there in doing things in that way. But not everybody felt that like that, of course. It's still worked at now. Sue is still working at new trustees who come on board and get them to stand, and bringing people we support to the trustees board meetings has helped with that, because they can see what the people we support are interested in right in front of them, and it's different to what they might be interested in. So at the last board meeting, for example, was a couple of people sitting there with people we support, and they just asked me, because I'm responsible for training, what are you going to do to get more people you support engaged in delivering training? And so I've got to go away and do something about that. So that's happening, and it influences people. Is that okay? I've talked about continuous improvement, and I've talked about the consultative structure. Those, if I was summarising it on sort of one page, I think that's the stuff that works. There's obviously a lot of detail behind that, but in terms of strategic approach, I think that's about it.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So, once again, any questions for Stephen? Sit down, Stephen, rather than... I'm sure that we could open up an informal conversation now. So, because you've raised so many issues, really listening to you, I know it's not an easy thing to bring about this change, but it sounds as though it's really embedded, and you were very instrumental in making it happen. So, any questions? Gore.
I've got a question about the training and coaching. So what we hear a lot, particularly from some consumer advocacy organisations, is that you would know them as NVQs, the kind of what we call Cert 3, Cert 4 here. The content is wrong, and there's no indication of quality, and certainly not of people having the right values.
Okay.
But for us, we also have an agenda to try and, in a sense, professionalise the sector and make it a more attractive place to work. And professionalisation is certainly, key to that. So I'm interested to hear more about what you see, what you've done in the kind of training space, particularly to ensure even how you recruit people, ensuring that they have the right values when you don't have a ready reckoner like having the right qualifications.
Yeah, I think you're right. It does start with recruitment. So we use the matching staff process primarily to do that. So we are bringing into the and we supporting that obviously. So we're bringing into the organisation people who are kind of tuned in to the way that we're thinking anyway. So it does start there. I think the whole NVQ thing there is a bit of an issue about that, I think because of the size of the organisation that United Response is, we've managed to have a bit of influence over that. So in the UK it's moved on now from NVQs to apprenticeships. Some people call them modern apprenticeships, and the government money is all going to fund apprenticeships for people. And we've been quite fortunate in being able to influence that. So we've been able to influence the implementation and some of the design of that approach, and in fact achieved awards for the approach that's been taken there. And we found that that's actually more attractive to people for some reason. It's almost the same content actually. I suppose it's 15% different content maybe to what the old NVQ stuff was. But people really seem to be buying into that. They seem to like the idea of an apprenticeship leading to some qualification as somehow different to achieving an NVQ. So that seems to be working, interestingly. We also do training, by the way, separate to that, things like values. So we do values training, as it's called. So we, as well as recruiting the right people in, there's a training course, if you like, around the values of the organisation and what that means in terms of how you support people. And then there's mandatory training for everybody. I think it's 2 days in person-centred tools stuff as well. And then there's additional stuff for leaders and potential leaders and managers, which takes them further into that and also into other areas such as positive behaviour support and those kind of things. So, but I think there's lots of different ways. There's lots of different offerings. Some people can kind of pick and mix what's appropriate. I think that works quite well. that answer your question?
It does, but then you've also seen some casualisation of the workforce in the UK, and that's one of the risks that we are highlighting, particularly now, to government, which in some way works against professionalisation, and some, and has other spin-offs in the labour market which are not positive, about people being disconnected from organisations, disconnected from learning communities, potentially exploited, not understanding their rights at work, those sorts of trends as well.
I think that's a really difficult area. Around the professionalism bit, I remember when I was at the FaHCSIA some years ago, there was a lot of noise then around professionalising social care, and people like SCIE and what was then the Social Care Council, or whatever it was called, were talking about a professional recognition for social care workers, but it seemed to all get too difficult, and it's kind of gone very quiet now and gone away. So it's not. I don't recognise it as a huge issue at the moment in the UK, although it was a few years ago. The whole thing around casualisation of the workforce as well, I think there are different approaches to that. Some organisations, like United Response do, actually have what's called a relief bank, so that those people are actually, they work casually, so they don't work all the time, but they are employees of the organisation, and treated as such. So maybe they only work one day a week or one day every 3 months or whatever it is. They get similar training and they get brought up, if you like, in the same kind of values. So they're treated as members of the organisation. There's some risks associated with that, obviously, but actually it's never been a big issue for the organisation in terms of that employment relationship. Some other organisations don't do that. They operate very much on a kind of bank basis, where people are literally casual workers and don't have an employment contract. I don't know. It depends what suits you, really. If you're going to do that, I think you still need to work hard at that values and stuff, even with those people. The problem that I've seen is around agency staff, so people employed by employment agencies. That's a real difficult area, and there was a huge effort in United Response to drive that out of the organisation. Yes, it cost a lot of money, but again, what happened was, and we did this through the consultative mechanism, it got out of control and it became a big cost. But not only that, clearly, as I mentioned earlier, what that did was have a serious effect on the people we support, and the staff knew that. They knew that better than we did as directors, actually. They knew it. So when we came along and said, this is a bit of a problem, look what's happening here, too many agency staff, don't share our values, it's not good for people we support. They said, damn right it isn't, we'll help you sort that out. So actually the staff themselves came up with loads and loads of different ideas to drive that out of the organisation. And Sue, the chief executive, ran a competition for the best idea, gave somebody £100 for a great idea for reducing that. And it just really took off. And it wasn't to do with cost, really, although that was associated. It was because the staff really got it. They really understood this issue of people have got to behave in the right way, and they've got to be there for the people we support. So, and I think that's a real success. The agency costs absolutely tumbled as a result of that, of course. But more importantly, we had more regular staff there with the people we support.
Is there something to do with the awards system that's different? That, I'm just asking a question. I don't know who the question is. It actually might be to you, Gordon, actually, rather than, because in the UK, I don't think they have the same limitations around the award that we're sort of restricted by in Australia, and I think that's part of the impediment around the workforce risk for Australia, is that we have these strange systems here, and we're prone to regulation in this country. Fix it, we'll regulate it, we'll do this, we'll do, but all these are very complex industrial awards, whereas in the UK, my experience, having lived there myself, is that we didn't, certainly when I was working in residential work, we weren't restricted by, it didn't really matter if I worked 5 hours or 10 hours or 15. I entered into an agreement with the organisation about how I worked,
Absolutely.
a group of individuals, and my work plan was about those individuals and the outcomes that we were. And so, but here we have a lot more impediments to that, I think, and I think that's part of the tension. That and maybe that's a role for us as a big body to do some work in that area a bit more with about how we are doing. But it's a real tension, isn't it? I think providers, it's one of the things that most of you will raise with my being team that I support, and when we're going out to organisations. There's this constant, well, that's fine, this is where we want to go, and we want to keep people control, but we've got fire staff who work 40 hours, and they've got to work 40 hours, and the shifts have to look like this, and they can't
That's
do
so
this.
true.
And then when you try to translate that conversation with a person in their plan and a family, they look at it just saying like, that doesn't work for me. It's not going to work for me.
So the resident actually gets, the service user, the individual gets lost in all those governance kind of things that we don't have a choice but to abide by.
And I think that's really important. Again, one of the things that I commented on yesterday was it's critical to being person-centred. The thing is, you've got to construct the support for the person being supported, not for the staff. But you're right. Those restrictions don't exist.
And those employment laws don't allow that flexibility. So if you're wanting, so if a person with support wants someone to be there first thing in the morning to assist with showering or breakfast, whatever that might be, and it's an hour here and then an hour there, we don't have that flexibility. We just can't.
It's against the law. It's against the law.
And it's actually gotten worse than it used to be, because our current federal government introduced what's called here the Modern Award about 3 years ago. And the old award under which our workforce operated was, whilst it wasn't the most flexible, what we have now is even less flexible than the rigidity that's imposed on organisations that are employing people. And one of the effects of that has been an increase in the casualisation of people who are working every day. And so if you're not engaged as a full-time person or a permanent person, even on less hours than a full-time person, you're engaged as a casual. So there's a definite increase in more casuals being used, which goes to that question of what you raised about agency staff, where your casuals need to be part of the organisation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And agency staff, it brings a whole lot of other problems that we dealt with many times ago. But I think the casualisation of the workforce is a concern, because the opportunities for career as direct support providers for people is seen as a kind of reduced significance for people, because they're all casuals out there. You can get a job anywhere in a group home, blah blah blah, and it actually is reducing, as having a reducing effect on the perception of what it is to work in disability field. I think that long term it's a problem for us.
And also the loyalty, that translates to a loyalty as a casual staff, because you would imagine that they'd be working in a whole, a number of different facilities. So therefore the loyalty to, the way that your service is operating, this person-centred approach and dealing with the specific resident, etc., is diluted as well.
But we seem to be losing in the conversation what's important about trying to, as a person with a disability, I'm now thinking from a very personal perspective about this, in terms of family member, just trying to get people to understand that it's actually purposeful to come in and do the task with my family member, however meaningful or meaningless that other people may think. For me, that's really important to convey that, and the importance of, helping the person that, I'll get up in the morning and get ready and get downstairs and get on with life is a really, that's in my family, that's a really important part of that, of enabling that person to participate. And we seem to lose that in trying to professionalise this, selling a profession. I think that's a really meaningful thing to say to someone. You're really helping this person get on with their life. And that to me is, we've got to sell, if you like that, differently than this, career. Because not everyone is going to have an academic career and a management career, and there are other values that we've got to put on purpose almost. So I don't know whether or not we're having the right conversation about employment stuff.
I think we've got to recognise there has to be a turning point, because for years we've been told that we have to professionalise, and now we've got to go the other way. I think everybody's willing, but we need a map.
Well, good conversation. We could go on over lunch. But so thanks, Pauline and David and Trish for raising these issues with Miriama. But I think that we probably will need to bring it to a close, and the way that we like to bring it to a close is that we ask Shirley and Ben just to make a comment on how relevant you think today has been for the lives of people with disability.
Okay, well, Shirley hasn't written anything yet, that's why she's just...
It's okay, Shirley.
That's why she's lost it. But I guess also, like, from today,
thanks, Ben.
I thought it was really, really interesting just to see what's happening, like in the UK at the moment, especially because they've sort of already gone through the sort of the self-managed fund thing, where we're coming up to that, and just to see what challenges that Stephen has faced within that change. It's just like confirmed for me what challenges we may face as well as an organisation, and also like as a country.
Good. Thanks very much, Ben. Shirley, should we come back to you, or just you gave such a wonderful opening? We could leave it at that.
Play it again.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you. So, could we just finish up now with how you're feeling and how's this breakfast been for you? And that's also a way of thanking Stephen. So, could I ask somebody to take the first turn? Okay, great, thanks.
I'm feeling pretty inspired, actually. I really enjoyed the conversation today, and one thing that's very inspiring for me is to bring more of the person-centred language into my work and the tools, and I think that it was very useful for me to hear your experiences with the strategic plan, and also sending that message down from the top throughout the organisation. I'll be very quick, but the other thing that was really important to me was the congruence of service delivery, and people entering the programs or the service at any point within the organisation and getting the same service and the same language.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Which way do you want to pass the turn? Gore. So how are you feeling?
I think I'm just realising, there are no easy answers. I mean, I've had a lot of experience in the UK. Most of my experience was actually in the UK. And if I think, been in Australia 6 years, if I think about, where the disability service system was, 5 years ago in Australia, and I just got notification that the government has announced they're going to introduce, the Medicare levy to pay for this thing, which starts on the 1st of July. And we're all kind of really anxious about how it's going to work and that sort of stuff. But it's just incremental progress, isn't it? It's just, take a small thing at a time, look at it, pull it apart, put it back together again. Your starting point was hire the person to do the job for the person that's being supported. It's just in those small ways, I think, we'll build this thing. And actually, there are no easy answers from other jurisdictions. There's lots of really interesting learning, but we've got to create this thing here from the ground up, with whatever impediments we face here, using what we've got.
Yeah. Thanks, Gordon. Great. Georgina?
I particularly like the principle of personalisation throughout the organisation, and I think that's really I mean, I feel like we already do that, but not as a systematic way of thinking. And so how you formally approach an organisational structure through those principles, as opposed to informally, to me is really something very powerful to take away.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Yeah, I really like lots of points, but the discussion around risk enablement is just a great frame on that sort of thought, and judging the care that you're giving someone as to whether it's actually disempowering them in some way or another. And I like the fact that they asked you to tell you a joke in the interview, because
I didn't.
It's like that's where life is. You know, if you're just so professional and so pompous or whatever that you can't engage
Absolutely.
at some sort of level with the person, then you know maybe you're not quite in the right space. You'd be a great banker or something. No offence to bankers, but you know, it was just a kind of little insight into how you might put it in practice and what expectations would be.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sarah.
Well, I was in a really fortunate position. I got to hear Stephen and some of my colleagues here yesterday and also this morning. And I think in my role, what I've now got is some other things to have conversations with organisations about at that senior management and board level, and really asking them to think about how they might use person-centred approaches and thinking to some of those small steps that we need to make as organisations and in terms of the new systems, new reforms that happen.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Julie.
I too heard Stephen talk yesterday, and putting yesterday into today together has kind of helped me to begin to formulate where we go next, and some suggestions at a strategic level about, rather like Georgina, about there's a lot of informal stuff around person-centred approaches, but making that more of a framework and structure that's has clarity.
Thank you. Shall we start here? Pauline, how's it been for you?
Well, look, I think one of the things you've reignited my engagement around passion, and thanks for that. I'm getting a bit worn out. And I feel a bit emotional, and I think that's what. So I think that's what that's about. It's about that passion coming up to the surface, and the importance of actually taking the time out to allow that to reignite. So thank you. Thank you for that.
I've taken much from it, thank you very much. I love your examples, particularly from an HR and team management perspective, and how we can be person-centred. I find myself sometimes when not at that frontline position, that applying a lot of what we hear and learn to my own specific role. And so I've made several commitments to myself based on the conversation today, and most of them revolve around there's absolutely no reason why I can't involve families and people in support directly in what I actually do. So thank you very much for that.
Yes, thanks Stephen for this morning. It was fabulous. I feel very inspired, very motivated. For me personally, it's just broadened my thinking of person-centeredness and just how widely it can be applied, not just to residents but to staff, meetings, families. It's just really broadened my thinking.
Good.
Thanks.
Miriam.
Thank you. Also, much as Kylie was saying, the idea of applying the language to change the whole culture of the organisation, so not just looking at person-centredness for an individual. Also, the focus on risk enablement as opposed to risk aversion, because I think that that's really the obstacle that we all have to fight as service providers to actually get what the resident wants. And ultimately, the message today is really quite simple: listening to what the individual wants and making sure that we meet his or her needs.
Great, thanks, Miriam.
Thank you, Stephen. What I got out of it today is that I feel now I'm in a position to make a commitment and to follow through with we're moving in FaHCSIA, however slowly, and just to keep that conversation going. We've set up a roundtable conversation model, the same as we do here, with the staff every 2 months. So just, yes, I've just made a commitment today. So
Oh, very
good
good.
about that.
Thank you. Maria.
Yes, thank you. Like you guys have said, Mariana, as well, about the risk assessment instead of risk enablement, I find that a lot of those issues are with the staff, but I think it just comes from management down. You know what I mean? It's educating and not forgetting that we're here to support those people and not just what's easier for us as well. We're here for them, and that's why practically we have the job, is to be with them and do what they want to do. Yeah, so really.
Thank you. David?
I have a joke for you.
This is brilliant.
This is black caviar, and the cartoon is entitled "Another Take on 50 Shades of Hay," and here's black caviar looking all sexy, and the horses are saying, "Forget it, you'd have to catch her first."
You get the job then, Dave. You get the job.
But the other thing I thought I had was I was reading a piece in the paper the weekend, and I'm a bit of a collector of things that people say, and one of the best things, this little snippet came from a bloke that was commenting on the economic situation in one of the European countries, and he was sort of talking about Europe in general, and he said, an outgoing tide lowers all the ships. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. And I think what we've been doing here at CDS with Stephen and all the other previous things is trying to make sure that we all come up together, that we're on a rising tide, and we all make it. And the learnings and the exposures to what's been going on in the UK. And I know some of our people at your workshop and enjoying it, because I've asked them for feedback in the last hour or so. It's all about our sector and the people we support, and these enormous numbers of more people that we're going to be supporting through the NDIS, that we do raise the bar and not lower the bar, and we keep on raising the bar, and I think all of these things are contributing to that, so thanks, Steve.
Would you like to tell Stephen who black caviar is?
No.
He went to
Champion race-offs.
I could have guessed that.
Sam, yourself, how's it been for you today?
Very good. I think it's just fantastic to see. I think the model organisation is so embedded in person centres. I think lifting the bar of those organisations here that have been dabbling in person centres to see all this is where
Is it Alan?
Firstly, I'd like to thank you for your very authentic interpersonal style. I've got to make a presentation to a group of frontline workers and middle managers in a couple of months' time, and I've been thinking about what are some of the take-home, practical things to take home, and I'll put on the top of that list the one-page profile as a very practical way of getting into this. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Julian?
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's been a wonderful 2 days. I've really, really enjoyed it. I think the idea of optimistic discontent I'm feeling intensely. I'm really excited, but thinking, there's so many things that we need to do and we have done. So it's celebrating those little sort of things that we've achieved, and we know we've got a long way to go. And I'd also like to say to being sitting at this table has been a delight. Ben, Shirley, I've had a lovely time. It's been really lovely. Thank you.
Thanks. Ben?
I think I'm feeling more knowledgeable and more aware of what the future is for all of us.
Thank you. Amelia?
Yeah, unlike everyone else, I really enjoyed today. I enjoyed listening to your experience, especially your personal experience. I think I learned more how to use person-centered tools in the workplace, so hopefully I can use it.
Thanks, Amelia. Shirley, do you want to make a comment?
It was good. I enjoy it.
Great.
Thank you, Shirley.
And Claire, at the back.
I really enjoyed the talk. I particularly like the stories about your daughter. Sometimes I forget what I'm meant to be doing because I've listened. So.
Great. Good. Well, it's been very good having you here, Stephen. Thank you, and for just being here to share what is a very successful organisation. How has it been for you?
It's been great. Thank you very much for your attention and listening and contributions. It's always good when an audience listens to what you've got to say and doesn't walk out halfway through and all that kind of stuff. But even an opportunity to add to my stock of jokes, which is fantastic.
Well, just before we do finish up, thanks, Stephen. The last breakfast is coming up, and I think is it on the 18th or 17th of May, whatever. And at that breakfast, we bring everything together because, as you know, we're funded under the Public Design Fund, NDIS, and we will be presenting a blueprint for change based upon all our conversations. And at the moment, we're working on an electronic CD-ROM that's incorporating the presentations, the videos, the graphics, and but we hope also what we will be presenting is 6 steps that have come out of this based upon the 6 speakers. There could be something that would be useful to people out in the field. There are quite a few people that sent apologies today. I expect that people will be here for the last one. Some people are not here today. I would encourage you to come. It'll be a lot of action orientation so that we can get your ideas about the blueprint, and so that you could also maybe validate what we had done to date, because we would like to have photographs of us all in this blueprint, and it'll be up to you individually as to whether you're happy to have your name associated with it. So that's the sort of things that we'll be doing at the next breakfast. We've tried 2 avenues just to get a final inspirational speaker. We went to ADIC, and that hasn't worked out. Not available. Although if we'd approached him earlier, I'm sure he would have been. And then we've still got an invitation out to the New South Wales Disability Care Director, or whatever that person's called, Rob Watkin. But we're not quite too sure. Sam's been following up on all of this. We're a bit unsure, aren't we, at this stage? Yeah. Okay. So if any of you have got, an inspirational speaker that you think might just fit this last session, on the other hand, there's plenty for us to do, but we do hope that you will come, and we've formed ourselves into a real community now, so it'll be a way to say goodbye to one another as well. So go well. We'll see you soon.